It was time to get acquainted with the Rudek Empire, in which peace and tranquility reigned, and during this period the ruler decided to marry the daughter of the most powerful family, after which the eldest daughter of the most wealthy and influential family, Espelund, became the empress and soon gave birth to the ruler with twins, of which a boy immediately received the title of crown prince. But after some time, the emperor married another woman who was from the Schwindel family, and whose fighting power enabled the ruler to strengthen the position of the empire among other countries, and a second prince was born from her. Soon after, the second empress was murdered, but her death remained unsolved and the murderer was never found. And the emperor eventually stripped the first prince of the title of heir and gave it to his second son, the official reason for this event being the excessive cruelty of the first prince. But now people chanted the name of the same prince and congratulated him on his return from the war, where he won another victory. The people rejoiced at the first prince of Raven, and people said that he bore the title of duke. Moreover, he immediately entered the battle and his bravery was liked by the people. Those present whispered that he was not even wounded, and believed that the rumors about his love of war were true, especially considering that he did not miss a single battle, although some people believed that the first war was his fault. People were whispering and wondering if these imperial twins had really shed so much blood and discussed other rumors. It was already more privately discussed that it was these children who killed the second empress, and the prince's assistant remarked to himself that people do not change and in front of anyone else they would not even dare to scream. Raven looked in the direction of the crowd, where silence reigned immediately, and the aide asked the prince to simply not pay attention to these people. Then there was a scream and one girl burst forward and ran to the hero, and her brother ran after her saying that it was necessary to go back immediately, but the girl had reached her goal and was not going to leave. Her brother began to apologize for his sister's behavior and asked the girl to also apologize and leave. Then the little girl handed the prince a book and declared that she was his fan, and then called him brother. As it turned out, there were also representatives of the Raven Espelund fan club in the crowd, which consisted of ordinary people, and the young women immediately began to chant his name with trepidation and praise his qualities and beauty. The excited girls tried to break through to the object of their adoration and showered him with gifts and attention, but the girl meanwhile did not go, and when he looked at her, she asked to leave her autograph on the book A Prince Among the Roses. And now let's meet our heroine Angela, who did a good deed and helped the woman write what she asked for. So at the end the woman praised the girl for her abilities and advised her to go to the city and earn money by making custom signs. Angela laughed, considering the proposal of this conservative grandmother not suitable for her, and she continued to say that it is a pity that such a beauty is lost in the village. In parting, the woman told our heroine that she could introduce her to one handsome boy, but the girl refused, because she had already lost her account with an unsuccessful date. Nevertheless, our heroine thought about a trip to the city, and despite the fact that it was extremely difficult, she still wanted to go there because her crush prince was there. She knew there were some bad rumors about him, but she didn't want to believe them. Suddenly, Angela heard the local girls talking about the first prince returning to the capital, so she immediately went to these acquaintances to ask about the prince, and they kindly spoke to her, thinking that she was also a fan of Raven. And without waiting for an answer, they began to praise the prince, calling him attractive and someone who perfectly knows the art of swordsmanship, and if rumors are to be believed, then also the owner of a pleasant character. Our heroine asked the girls how they became fans of the prince and whether they had seen his portraits, and the interlocutors were taken by surprise. Then the girls asked Angela when exactly she became a fan of Raven, and our heroine did not have time to answer, as the girl showed the book A Prince Among the Roses and declared that after reading it, with a 90% probability, every woman will fall in love with a prince, and then added that this is a wildly popular and interesting publication. Angela grabbed the book and said she would borrow it for a while, read it quickly, and return it right away. The girl was upset because she did not receive the money and nervously told her friend that it would be good to pay and read for comfort. Suddenly, the girls saw that the guard of the imperial family had arrived in their village, and they thought about the question of what these people needed here. And the man was already heading towards them and asked if a person named Angela lived in this village. Meanwhile, our heroine looked at the edition and did not understand how her fanfic became a book, and noticed that the strange writing style exactly repeated her handwriting. The girl began to wonder who needed to distribute these texts, and remembered that she had written it a long time ago and had not shown it to anyone, except for the street vendor who lent her money when she was going to buy another portrait. Angela was now sure that the whole problem was with this street vendor, and then she remembered that today was the day he was supposed to appear, and she decided to get even with him for publishing her own book behind her back and now selling an edition. Our heroine was deeply shocked by the fact that people are willing to pay money for this stupid fanfic, which they consider stupid. Then she thought about the fact that the prince had seen him too and got angry because she was ashamed. Our heroine decided to find a merchant and demand from him the original book, and even came to the idea that this writing may seem delusional, but it could become a problem, especially since she is no longer a child, although, strangely enough, this thing found its purpose the reader. At that moment, the same girls knocked on her room and asked if she was reading a book, and Angela apologized in response and commented that the text was really interesting. But at the same time, the girls said that these people are looking for her, assuming that the author of the novel A Prince Among the Roses is Angela. The guards, meanwhile, told our heroine that with her silly joke she had disturbed the peace of the imperial family and therefore they were forced to detain her on charges of espionage. And on the same morning, an imperial council was held in the palace, where the chancellor announced that before the arrival of the crown prince, he would like to hear the opinion of the honorable members of the council about this victory. The chancellor was interested in their opinion as to whether they found His Highness Raven Espelin to have once again accomplished a true feat. One of the men said that he was not going to deny his merits, but wanted to point out that the actions of the prince were full of cruelty and reminded that there are already rumors about this. Another member of the council inquired about the village, which seemed to him, and he completely destroyed it and did not spare anyone, and the others reminded that it was rumored that the prince was burying his prisoners alive. The chancellor laughed and said that the prince was risking his life by performing exploits, and his bad reputation was still growing and reminded him of the proverb that no matter how many wolves you feed. At that moment, our prince's twin sister Hoya Espelin defiantly stood up and walked past the chancellor. He immediately reminded her that the meeting was about to begin and urged her to take her seat. The princess looked the man in the eye and declared that it smelled so bad that she simply could not be in the midst of all this confusion and warned that she would be back soon. While the members of the council were scolding her for her intemperance, the girl went out and reflected on the fact that she thought that the military merits would change her brother's image. But they only damaged his reputation, and thought that at this rate Raven was bound to get into something big and unpleasant. Suddenly, she heard her brother being discussed by the girls and calling him super cool. Then the conversation turned to the book one of them had taken with her, and the other was worried that they would be caught by some member of the imperial family, and then everyone would be in trouble. Hoya decided to understand the gist of the conversation and approached the girls, then asked what they were talking about, allowing herself to mention the name of Prince Raven. The girl immediately said that the prince was so awesome in the book and stated that she wasn't trying to slander him in any way. And then the princess realized that she hadn't heard that her brother was considered cool at the same time he's surrounded by terrible rumors. Hoya asked the girls to tell her everything in detail about this book and immediately found out that it was called A Prince Among the Roses, and was then informed that about 2 weeks ago, this fanfic, rather a novel, became insanely popularity among the people, and now the princess understood why there was such a strange atmosphere outside when the prince went to the palace. The prince, too, was already aware of the existence of this book, and was cursorily familiarizing himself with its contents, but with each line he fell into a greater and greater frenzy. At one point, he grabbed his dagger and pierced the book, and his assistant asked if the work really looked like a masterpiece and expressed his desire to get to know its contents as well. Raven said that he could not bear to even look at such a blatant abuse of him and declared that he must get rid of him, and when his assistant asked who he was talking about, the prince firmly replied that he meant the author of this writing. And our heroine was already frightened by the fact that her old fan fiction was distributed, and in addition, she was accused of espionage, and now she did not understand what was happening. The girl was trying to figure out whether it was a cart or her coffin, although this transport was positioned as an imperial one, but then it was unclear why it was falling apart on the move. Suddenly, the cart hit a stone and really crashed, which upset our heroine very much. Just at that moment, Angela remembered how she was sold as a child, stressing that the girl, though simple, could handle paperwork and writing perfectly. The buyer then declared that all this was of no use to her, as the girl would have to work on the farm for the rest of her life, and called her a worthless creature. Now our heroine had a real sense of déjà vu and was thinking about whether she should run away, but then she thought that if she ran away, would she be able to meet the prince again like last time? Then the girl stopped at the fact that these people did look like knights of the empire, so she just had to believe in the mercy of the prince, and suddenly heard the guards talking about whether she should be taken further at all, because she would be attacked at any time. In any case, death awaits. One of them shared that he had heard that the case was being investigated to see if she acted on the prince's side, and added that the publication of this novel, which glorifies the Halabutir prince, already looks strange. And our heroine realized that she had to run, and then, despite her fear, she thought of jumping from the wagon. But at that moment, someone's strong hand grabbed her by the waist and pulled her to him, saving her life. Then the mysterious stranger asked our heroine to return to the cart and wait for him inside. In a matter of seconds, the guard noticed that the rider was not on the horse and began to look around in all directions. The guard decided that it was an ambush and immediately took up their swords, although they said about themselves that the strength of the enemy was terrifying. And when they saw their opponent, they asked his name and declared that he dared to attack the knights of the empire. Then one of the knights paid attention to the spots that decorated the rider's horse, and remembered that Prince Raven's horse looked the same and realized that it was him. When the guard found out that the prince was in front of him, he realized that they would all be dead, although at one point the knight thought that Raven would spare him. The young man thought about everything and came to the conclusion that he needed to run to the palace and report everything to the imperial family. But the prince decided not to allow this, after which our heroine realized that she would never get out of here alive and even said goodbye to the prince until the next life. Angela eventually passed out and the prince's aide began to worry that she was dead, at which point Raven stated that the girl had simply passed out from shock and asked the young man why he had followed him. and the prince heard back from the assistant the accusation that it was he who pursued him, while he was on a secret mission from Ms. Hoya. Raven wondered what his sister was up to again, while the aide was outraged that the prince had taken his own horse and wondered what would happen if someone recognized him. The assistant asked the prince what he was going to do, and he, meanwhile, reminded that he wanted to get rid of the writer himself. The young man immediately told the prince that he could not do this, because as part of his task, received from his sister princess, he must deliver the author to her at any cost. Raven questioned harshly how he dared stand in his way and reminded him that he was his bodyguard and not his sister's knight by any means, so he should know better than anyone whose order he was following first. And then the aide asked back why he saved this girl before him, when she was jumping from the cart. The prince thought for a while, because he did not know the answer, and therefore decided to say that if his sister had already said that she would explain everything later, then he decided to leave his revenge for later. Raven also added that Hoya has such a personality that it is impossible to predict how she would react if she found out that her order had failed. And then his assistant asked the prince to return to the palace first, and he would take care of the rest himself. The next day, representatives of the imperial family came to the place where the corpses of their knights were found and concluded that the worn arrows clearly indicated that this was the work of bandits who were hunting for the riches of the nobles. The knights began to talk among themselves about what had happened, and then the chancellor interrupted their remonstrances, in himself inwardly indignant that he could not believe that they were wasting their time on this worthless business of a simple writing, and confessed that just wanted to deal with everything as soon as possible and forget about it. The chancellor noticed that the crown prince looked extremely displeased and concluded that he would never know or understand what he was thinking, while the young man meanwhile determined that all the blows were aimed at vital organs and the rest of the camouflage served as a cover. When the chancellor asked the crown prince his opinion, the young man replied that all this was certainly interesting and worth paying attention to. And our heroine woke up and now thought about the fact that it was all just a dream, but then she noticed that the environment around her was different, and in her whole village, no one could find such luxurious furniture. Angela almost hysterically concluded that this was the end of her, then asked herself when she would be able to enjoy such a luxury again, and thought that she should thank the masked gentleman she met before she passed out. She remembered the blows of swords, bloody splashes, and this did not prevent our heroine from mentally thanking the masked gentleman for the fact that now she has such wonderful memories and simply incredible dreams. But it soon dawned on her that if it wasn't a dream, then maybe she had been killed and was now dead and gone to the underworld or something. And when she looked around, she came to the conclusion that there could not be such a beautiful house in the other world, and concluded that so much had happened in one day that she could no longer put anything into a whole picture. She was curious as to why it all happened, and she looked for the culprits among a whole list of suitors, which included a masked man, an imperial knight, and here a dude who decided to sell her a fanfic she had written in her early youth. Angela thought back to the words she'd heard as a child when she'd been bought and told she'd have to work on a farm for the rest of her life and called a worthless creature, and thought she shouldn't start writing at all. On the other hand, the girl did not want to lose anything from all her good memories associated with the prince who always helped her. These memories led her to a direct relationship between the little prince she knew as a child and the man in the mask. Our heroine was shocked by this discovery, which she made, because it turned out that the man in the mask, who was the murderer, was also a prince. After a few minutes, Angela developed her thoughts by arguing that the prince is a very good person and this cannot be. Suddenly a servant came into the room, having heard the commotion within, and introduced herself to Elridge's, explaining that she had been placed before her, and that it was a great honor for her to serve the learned lady. To the surprised and inquisitive look of our heroine, Elridge's explained that she was met by the estate of the first Prince Raven Espelund in the Rudek Empire. Our heroine tried to understand what she had heard, which was extremely difficult for her, because her thoughts screamed to her that the psycho in the mask, who covered everything around with blood, could very well turn out to be a prince, and the same thoughts advised her to disappear into the fog as soon as possible. Elridge's, meanwhile, was turning to Ms. Scientist and asking if she could address her less formally and saying she was like her little sister, while Angela tried to explain that she wasn't a scientist at all. At that moment, there was a knock in the room and Manhwa appeared in the doorway, who turned to the maid and said that he was just asking to check whether the scholar was awake, but not to chat with her. The girl apologized, and our heroine concluded that in this aristocratic house even the servants are extremely elegant and thought that it was like a completely different world. Elridge's addressed the gentleman with the word that the scholar was still in her pajamas and very elegantly ushered them outside to allow the girl to dress and make herself up. When the maid finished dealing with the men, she offered our heroine to change her clothes, to which the latter immediately asked where they would go after that. Soon, Angela was already pinching herself to be sure that this was not a dream, but that the real prince was sitting in front of her and was thinking about whether he remembered her. Raven sat across from him and silently incinerated the girl with his gaze, thinking about how she was beating him. This silent battle continued between them for a long time. At that time Manhwa even had the desire to break free. Soon it was reported that the princess had arrived, and she, entering the room, immediately thanked the prince's assistant for a good job, and then looked at our heroine and congratulated her as the author of the book. Angela immediately said how to address her and stood up, but the princess told her to sit down because she was a special guest for them. Our heroine thought she was seeing twins for the first time and concluded that they were extremely similar to each other and found Hoya extremely attractive. Then the sister greeted the brother, but he decided to postpone all conventions for later and immediately asked the sister threateningly why she had brought the author here. Then the princess explained that this girl was important to them and asked why he was so angry, when he should be thanking the girl for turning an idiot like him into the main character of her amazing book. Meanwhile, our heroine could not believe that she was sitting so close to this handsome man and was generally in the middle between the prince and the princess, and assumed that she was in an incredibly uncomfortable position. Angela thought that they really looked the same, the only difference was the presence of a dimple, although the prince also has one when he starts laughing, and he meanwhile asked his sister if she had read this essay and heard a negative answer. Raven angrily stated that there is a scene in this disgusting writing where he kisses his assistant, and the girl's reaction was unique, because the princess did not believe it, and our heroine finally met his bodyguard. Our heroine still felt an extreme sense of awkwardness and she wanted to at least disappear and at most just die. So she decided to urgently change the topic of conversation and asked the prince if he had saved her yesterday from the masked man, emphasizing that she had lost consciousness and nothing does not remember. Then the prince admitted that the man in the mask was himself. Raven also admitted that he was going to kill her on the spot and added that the reason she was here now was because of his sister's wishes. Then the prince told our heroine that if she wanted to live, she should burn all the nobles in the city and then disappear from his sight, and she had better do it soon, before he changed his mind. Raven looked at the author girl with her eyes radiating anger and wondered if she understood his words, while our heroine at this time wondered if it really was the prince. Suddenly, Hoya said that her brother was extremely chatty today and asked him why he was killing their author's mood, and emphasized that the girl was going to write a masterpiece for them. The princess asked our heroine to simply ignore his words, noticing how he scared this gentle creative creature, referring to Angela. To the girl's questioning look, Hoya explained that the reason they saved her was because they needed the story to continue, then asked if she knew why she was being taken to the imperial palace in the first place. The princess explained that the crown prince had not expected a few pieces of paper to have such an effect on public opinion, and then stated that they themselves were quite surprised to see the townspeople welcoming Raven back from battle. Hoya also noted that the image of the entire house of Espelent, which had been at rock bottom until now, had grown significantly and emphasized that the representatives of the Crown Prince's faction thought that they were the ones behind the scenes pulling the strings to regain the title of heir to the throne that had been taken from them. That is why they became interested in her as the main culprit of this brawl, because if the Espelent name is trampled in the mud, then it is difficult to fight openly with its representatives. The princess explained that they wanted to catch our heroine and at the same time accuse her family of manipulating public opinion, and then added that after that her life would be over. Hoya concluded that she and her brother benefit greatly from her affair, while the publication only harms the crown prince, so they saved her in order to gain even more from her work. The princess came to the conclusion that once it became known to everyone that she was the author of the original, then it would be very difficult for her to survive in the struggle with the imperial family. Hoya offered to protect her from any danger and expressed the hope that our heroine will continue to write the story about her brother, hiding her identity. The princess asked Angela how the proposed conditions suited her and asked her opinion, while Raven, meanwhile, was simply in a stupor. Hoya also emphasized that since the contract was signed, everything from the incident with the masked man must remain their secret and added that if our heroine suddenly decided to go and tell anyone, they would send there the masked lord, and he would get rid of her before anyone from the crown prince's faction got to her, and reminded her that she was in some danger anyway. Our heroine remembered the words of the guards who said that she was going to certain death and realized that this young woman was definitely not lying to her. Angela came to the conclusion that she was in danger, and that is why she risked her life and tried to jump off the wagon, and now she was thinking about new circumstances. At this time, the princess asked the girl whether she would sign the contract or not, which was practically equivalent to the question of whether she wanted to live or not. And our heroine said that she was ready to sign the agreement, and she herself came to the conclusion that she would just live for today. While our heroine was thinking that the princess was so cute that she wanted to die, the prince was thinking that his sister was doing what she wanted again. All Angela had now was a blank look, and the Elridges took her for a walk in town and tried to amuse her by dressing her in her clothes. The girl asked our heroine not to worry about her appearance, because soon they will buy her new clothes that correspond to the latest Rudek fashion. Elridges admitted that she has recently been working in the mansion and expressed her joy at the fact that she was lucky enough to serve such an important person as our heroine. The maid considered her charge uneducated, despite the fact that her position was higher than hers. The girl noted that our heroine has been looking depressed for some time, and noted that although she does not know the reason for what happened, she now needs to put aside all her worries. Angela decided that her assistant was right, especially now that she was in the dream city. The girls went for a walk, but had no idea that they were being watched, and the suspicious person was absolutely sure that our heroine was, without a doubt, the young person he had come for. Elridges suggested that our heroine start by looking at clothes, so the girls headed to the store, especially since the assistant knew the best places in this city. The Elridges also asked Angela to finally remove the formality between them and just call her by her first name. Our heroine immediately remembered the words of Mono, who told her to behave less stiffly and noted that she is considered a scientist, which means that no matter where she goes, she will be highly respected everywhere. The young man also noted that they all get a lot of help from her as an author and promised that everything will be fine, even if she behaves more confidently. And when Mono tried to talk about the scene with the kiss, our heroine decided to leave as soon as possible and, in parting, promised the assistant that she would take his advice on a note. So now, remembering the bad ending of their conversation, she decided to listen to her assistant. Elridges began asking the girl about her meeting with Prince Raven and how it all went. Our heroine thought that it was good that he did not remember her, although she noted about herself that his changes scared her and really regretted that she had written this creepy thing out of nothing to do, which now served these changes in her life. Angela didn't understand why he was threatening her, and her thoughts were interrupted again by the assistant asking if he was as cool as in A Prince Among the Roses and then adding that she was a big fan of that book. Elridges admitted that the prince makes her dizzy and she does not remember how many times she has reread this book, and then added that she is looking forward to the next part. Finally, the girls went to a clothing store, and our heroine said that she did not have money for such clothes at the moment, while the assistant said that money was not worth worrying about. Elridges explained that she received orders that if our heroine is going to stay in the mansion, then she needs clothes and must buy everything she needs, and in the store you just need to show a document with the prince's signature. When Angela asked whose order it was, she learned that Mono had ordered to do so, and our heroine thought that the prince really had no reason to care about her, so she was not even surprised. Meanwhile, the store manager recognized Elridges as the same girl who comes in every day to look at the beauty and gets her clothes dirty before leaving. Angela decided to look around a bit, while her assistant said that scientists are supposed to wear robes anyway, so there is no reason for her to dress up in nice clothes, and suggested that she buy something quickly and then go to a place where there is something delicious, and our heroine laughed to herself at the assistant's conclusions about the fact that she does not like to get dressed. Our heroine immediately noticed one wonderful dress and thought that she never had the opportunity to wear such an outfit. Elridges approved the choice of her ward, and at the same time the administrator shouted what she thinks about when she touches such precious things. The woman complained to the Elridges about how dare she touch these clothes without knowing their value, and explained that the clothes were made by a famous designer, and then pointed out that she comes here all the time, dressed like a pauper, and touches everything she owns, at will, at a time when she does not have money to buy such clothes. Our heroine thought about how this woman could speak to them in such a tone, and she continued to scold her assistant. The girl began to make excuses and said that she was really going to buy some things today. Angela noticed that Elridges was crying, although she had always thought that she was the type to fight back when she was insulted. Meanwhile, the girl wept and thought about the fact that she had no idea that she was thought of in such a perspective, and considered it a great shame that happened in front of her mistress. Our heroine decided to draw the administrator's attention to herself and stated that they were buying all this clothing and asked to pack it. Angela then announced that she was going to buy that expensive designer dress as well, and the woman yelled that she had no idea how much it was worth, that she was grabbing it so thoughtlessly. While the administrator tried to stop this lawlessness, our heroine said that she was going to wear it right now, and demanded that the rest be sent to this address and held out the document. The woman immediately saw Duke Raven Espellin's signature and then heard that her client was a scientist living in the prince's residence. Angela also said that she arrived here in a hurry, so she did not have time to prepare her clothes, and emphasized that she never thought that she would hear such insults in this place. Then the girl clarified whether the administrator understood everything and asked to send the purchases to the specified address, while the woman saw that her interlocutor had a confident expression and it did not look like a lie. And our heroine continued her speech and declared that the girl who is next to her is her assistant and is far from someone who can be treated with such contempt, and expressed the hope that in the future the woman will not make a similar mistake in relation to their customers. In a few minutes, a couple of girls were dressed in completely different outfits and they were already eating desserts. Our heroine couldn't believe that it was possible to use the prince's name to buy clothes and thought that they had spent a lot of money. She then remembered the princess saying that the reason they saved her was because they needed the story to continue, and then she remembered Mono saying that they were getting help from her as the author. Angela exclaimed that she was terribly annoyed by the thought, and then explained how she couldn't understand why the prince hated her so much if he was the one who needed her help, and emphasized that it would be only fair to not just spend his money, but to blow absolutely everything. At the questioning look of her assistant, our heroine declared that the prince is a very generous person and will definitely understand everything, and offered Elridges to buy everything she likes. After some time, the assistant noticed that people were gathering in a crowd and decided that there was something interesting, so she wanted to take a look. And at that moment, our heroine was grabbed by the hand by a stranger and signaled for her to be silent, and then asked her to follow him because he needed to tell her something. The girl tried to understand who it was, but he had already led her to the backyard of the street. Elridges turned to our heroine to tell her that the imperial carriage was here, but did not find it. Angela begged the man to let her go and explain everything and asked where they were even going, and he just kept telling her to keep quiet and just follow him because he had information for her. Then our heroine decided that the matter would not go that way and explained to him quite matter-of-factly that she ordered to let her go. She herself concluded that she needed to run away, and then she looked closely and realized that the same merchant who once took her manuscript was sitting in front of her. Our heroine asked the man why he behaved so suspiciously and asked why he needed to drag her to the alley, to which the man replied that it was all her fault and because of her affair he was constantly being persecuted. He said that he was mistaken for the author and that is why he keeps tearing down a bunch of wanted ads for him, but there is no end to them. Then the girl said that in this situation she should ask questions and at least know why this book even exists, and how he could go and sell her work without her permission. Our heroine stated that because of this she also now has difficult circumstances, and then expressed her sympathy for the fact that he was wanted, and explained that he had dug his own grave. The girl asked him what he would advise her to do about the threat that loomed over her, and admitted that yesterday she almost died altogether, and said that he should be the one to apologize to her. Then the man, taking out a knife, declared that she should forget about the apology because the victim is here. He said that he had no idea that there would be so many problems with this issue, and that it would be so dangerous, and he started threatening with a dagger. He said that he had no idea why our heroine was in this city, but that this was the chance of a lifetime, after which he demanded that the girl immediately go to the imperial family and tell them that he was not the author of the book. Our heroine remembered that this merchant was always very kind and thought about how things were going wrong, especially since she was not writing this story so that so many problems would happen. And at the moment when the man rushed at her, Angela started to run away, shouting that the person believed to be the author of the novel was here. People immediately reacted to these words and began to gather in crowds to look at the one who wrote the famous novel A Prince Among the Roses. The Imperial Guard immediately set about capturing this man, and later recognized the merchant as the man depicted in the wanted notice. The man understood that he needed to escape in any way, and people were pulling books to him and asking him to leave an autograph. Although the merchant in response asked to stay behind him and claimed that he was not the author. Our heroine thought excitedly that this was not at all what she expected. But on the other hand, this was her chance to quietly hide in the crowd and not be recognized, while the Imperial Guard demanded that everyone disperse. They were going to arrest the wanted criminal, and at that moment Angela also noticed these guards and did not understand what they had forgotten here, so she decided to run away quickly so that nothing bad would happen to her. At that moment, someone touched her injured shoulder and the girl screamed, and the young man asked if everything was okay with her, and our heroine had already decided that she was in trouble. She immediately noticed the coat of arms on this stranger's suit, and it was exactly the same as the Imperial Knight's, and she thought it was very dangerous, so she simply turned away. At the same time, the man noticed that she was wounded, but the girl replied that everything was fine with her and ran away from the scene. Our heroine did not know that she ran into the same crown prince, but he felt that there was something disturbing about this girl, and he noticed that she wore shoes along with the dress, and found even in this a certain strangeness. Meanwhile, the guard took the merchant, who continued to claim that he is not the author of the book, and that the creators of the text have a blonde girl. The crown prince noted this for himself and even turned to look at the same beautiful blonde, but there was no trace of her, and the young man decided to think again about why she disturbed him so much. Already in the evening, the heir was informed that the inhabitants of the village had been interrogated and now a portrait of the author had been drawn up, who said that she was a girl who was a blonde of low birth, and the assistant wondered if they needed to post new wanted ads. The prince ordered that new information be given to him and old announcements not be removed. And a few hours before that, the merchant resisted to the last, because he had nothing to lose, and almost lost his head, swinging his dagger at the air. The prince's bodyguard managed to silence and demanded to show respect to the crown prince. When the merchant heard who was standing before him, the bloody blade fell from his hand. The crown prince picked it up and thought that this blood definitely belonged to the girl he met the day before. Elridges, meanwhile, was tending to our heroine's wound and sobbing, saying that it was all her fault for being distracted by the imperial carriage, and Angela finally realized that the coat of arms belonged to the Schwindel family, who now controlled the empire, and remembered again the princess's words about that it will be difficult for her to survive after the information is leaked. The prince's aide then declared on the street that the book this man had written was creating chaos in the empire, and stressed that any such thing involving the imperial family would be seen as mocking the crown prince and would be punished accordingly. Crown Prince, meanwhile, thought about his own business and asked his assistant to leave everything as it was and go on, and then added that you shouldn't behave so rudely with a wanted person, because people are afraid. Our heroine thought that if she was caught, she would be in trouble, and came to the conclusion that danger is indeed waiting for her from all sides. She even thought that maybe it was time for her to run away without looking back, especially since a lot of events had happened in just one day. Elridges laments that it was all her fault, and admits that the shop lady was right about her wearing her best dress today to make a good impression on our heroine. The assistant said that she always dressed terribly because she had no money and reminded her that she had recently been hired, and again said that she was very lucky to serve her because before that she could not adjust to the job and just performed small errands. The girl also admitted that she completely lost her head because of the desire to show Angela all her good sides, because she had a chance to do something incredible, like taking care of a scientist, and then added that, as she thought, this important job it doesn't suit her either. And our heroine concluded that this girl is actually very timid and assumed that if she runs away now, she is not sure that everything will be fine with her. On the other hand, she thought that if she ran away now, she would end up hiding like that merchant, and she didn't want to go back to the way things were before. Angela thought about the fact that the wanted notices and the public editors indicated that they did not know the real author of the book, and about those knights who were killed by the masked man and at the same time her hero prince, which no one knew either, for which one should thank God, and then she stopped herself on what she was thinking about in general. Elridges continued to bemoan the fact that she had been placed in this position through pure chance, and indicated that she would ask for a suitable replacement in her place, at which point our heroine declared that there was no need. The girl said that it was only thanks to her that she was able to enjoy getting to know the outskirts of the city and asked not to worry. Angela asked the Elridges if she was hungry and offered something tasty to eat, then asked for the best place to eat in the area. Our heroine did not have to ask her assistant for this favor for a long time, and the girl immediately volunteered to carry out the assignment, while Angela restrained herself by the fact that they were not going to kill her because she was still needed as an author. Although she had no idea if the prince would really protect her, she had no other choice. Mono, meanwhile, was checking with the prince if he was really going to go, and Raven was indignant as to why this kid would head here again and just say yes. His bodyguard was immediately alarmed that his master was addressing the prince in this manner, and reminded him that he had better watch his words, for there were many people here. The butler immediately rushed to inquire where the Duke was going. The rest of the servants ran to see off their master properly. Raven told Mono that he would be gone for a few days and asked him to tell this child, explaining that he meant His Highness that he was away. And the young man thought that his master was once again putting him in a difficult position and simply left. At that moment, the guard of the Crown Prince appeared and blocked the way for our prince, and his bodyguard immediately asked what such things were going on, taking out his sword. The Crown Prince's head guard told Mono that this was an attempt at a surprise greeting from him and said that it was just a joke. After that, the young man greeted the prince and informed him that the Crown Prince was on his way here and asked him to stay and give him some of his time before his departure. The knight also apologized to Raven that his little joke might have offended His Highness. Meanwhile, our heroine found out that she was ordered to just go shopping and was not even told to take it with her. Elridges explained that this is why she had the official document, and she had already offered our heroine to go with her because she decided that she was bored. Angela immediately remembered how Mono had asked her to hold off on shopping for now as they needed to deal with the current situation so they wouldn't be in an awkward position. And the girl decided that they should return to the mansion as soon as possible, so as not to cause unnecessary problems. Our prince's attendants, meanwhile, tending to the horses of the Crown Prince's knights, were indignant that the detachment of their adversaries had arrived so suddenly and without warning. And after that, they also noticed that the knights began to pluck plants from the garden and asked them not to do this, but they, as if for evil, pulled the bushes further. Even the maids began to feel sorry for the poor footman, who was proud of the fact that he was able to restore that part of the garden that even their gardener could not cope with. But the other girl wanted to see the Crown Prince at last and was waiting for this moment. The topic then turned to discussing how handsome the Crown Prince was and why he rarely left the palace until the head maid stirred them up and got them back to work. The girls asked the eldest if the Crown Prince often came to the Duke's mansion unannounced like this, and the woman replied that he rarely made visits at all, much less personal ones, and even more so sudden ones, and suggested that perhaps something important had happened. The half-brother, meanwhile, spoke to our prince and congratulated him on his victory, and said that he had heard rumors that he himself had played a great part in it. He also apologized to Raven for arriving so unexpectedly and explained that if he had come with a warning, he would have run away from the meeting again. And he added that since Hoya does all the work, and he is almost never in the palace, this is the only way to meet our prince. The Crown Prince emphasized that Raven is in such a hurry that he doesn't even take off his coat, and our prince asked the interlocutor to quickly explain the reason for his visit and get away, because he wants to rest. The Crown Prince asked to remove the formalities between them, because these words openly indicate that they have distanced themselves from each other. Raven then asked the interlocutor to send his bodyguard away, stressing that he didn't want to look at his bodyguard's face after what had happened. The Crown Prince concluded that our prince was troubled by the incident, and the knight meanwhile thought about the fact that Mono was nowhere to be seen. The Crown Prince called what happened a trifle and apologized if it brought any tinge of offense. Then Raven demanded that he watch his knights properly, and emphasized that if he had not arrived at that moment, he would have finished them all by now. And then he added that he would not show such behavior to anyone, regardless of who is in front of him, a horse or a servant, and even if that person is the Crown Prince himself. The Crown Prince immediately repeated that it was only a joke and suggested that our prince was very upset by this incident and emphasized that it was so similar to him. Raven looked at his interlocutor and couldn't believe who the man had become, remembering that when they were little, he always sided with him and was sometimes even embarrassed by it. The Crown Prince noticed that his sister was indeed not here, and Raven stated that she had no business in his estate and said that they had been seeing each other recently. The young man stated that in that case he should have arrived earlier as he had something to say to the two of them and pointed out that they were both busy all the time. The Crown Prince then stated that he had come to see him on the occasion that his knights had recently been ambushed, and even though they were all skilled swordsmen, their weak point was equally easily discovered and killed. The young man said that the way they were destroyed seemed very familiar to him and reminded him of someone's handwriting. Then our prince interrupted him and asked him to stop spouting unsubstantiated nonsense, because he was already in a bad mood. Then the Crown Prince admitted that the person they were transporting had disappeared. The young man then stated that he had a portrait ready for the search and offered the prince to look at it, but Raven refused. The Crown Prince nevertheless insisted that our prince should look at the portrait, because the man was the author of the novel that had recently become so famous, and added that he thought he had seen the girl in his possessions on his way here, and when Raven clarified where exactly, the brother answered that it was on the city street. The prince looked at the sketch, and he himself thought that our heroine should be in her room, which, as it turned out, was empty, despite the fact that the prince's assistant begged the girl not to go out anywhere, and explained that it would be very bad if he will meet the Crown Prince, and then he completely thought that she had run away. At that moment, the guard of the Crown Prince approached Manhwa and scared him. For a moment he even doubted that he was standing before him the most powerful knight who serves Raven. Bourbon proposed to Manhwa to look for what he was so diligently looking for and why he was so distracted, but our prince's bodyguard replied that he did not need help, and he himself thought that he had almost pierced himself. Manhwa said that it was just another empty room in the estate and added that there was nothing to go anywhere without permission. And Bourbon, in turn, noticed that the room did not look like an empty one at all and asked where the owner of these apartments was. Our prince looked at the sketch and did not see any resemblance to our heroine at all, but then he began to find some small similarities. The Crown Prince watched his brother, and then asked his opinion and whether she did not seem familiar to him, and in addition added that the girl he had seen in the street was dressed in a dress and shoes and emphasized that her strange outfit was even quite cute. The Crown Prince confessed that he had not seen her face, for it was hidden by the hat, but she had attracted his attention, and again inquired of Raven if he knew her, to which the young man replied that he could not say for sure, considering only that description and not a clear picture. Raven thought that Frederick was wrong because there were so many discrepancies and decided that he had nothing to worry about and warned his brother not to associate their family with this writing, adding that it all annoyed him, and the Crown Prince, for his part, admitted that he had read this masterpiece. When his brother brought up the scene where our prince kisses the guard, Raven grabbed him and told him he needed a break and roughly kicked him out. The Crown Prince asked our prince if it was true that he hated this genre, but the reaction was very bright, so the brother said he was leaving. Manhwa stood and thought that he couldn't even go in search of our heroine due to the fact that he was under the watchful eye of another knight and thought that maybe it was even for the best that they didn't meet. The Crown Prince began to mention that Raven was once a child, and was interrupted by his knights before he could finish. They reported that the coachman had just left for the carriage and horses, so he would have to wait a little. The Crown Prince concluded that he was continuing to let his guard down involuntarily, then turned to his brother and reminded him that there would soon be a victory celebration in the palace. Frederick expressed his hope that on such an occasion he would still be present this time. Our prince declared that he would not come and reminded that he could not tolerate such measures and asked to leave. The Crown Prince stated at the time that this was why he had come in person to ask him to be present at the event, and expressed his confidence that many would want to meet the Espelin family that had played such a large role in this war. Frederick said that there was still time to think, and also added that he would leave the portrait, but our prince again said that it was not worth doing, because he had already replied that he did not know the person. When the Crown Prince approached our prince, he asked him to protect the author well. Frederick also emphasized that Raven must understand that his family will end if he allows him to take this girl for himself, and our prince could only guess where his interlocutor got this information. Raven concluded that Frederick had guessed that the author was in him, although he made sure that nothing was clear from his face and decided to clarify with the Crown Prince about where he saw this girl. In response, Frederick wondered why he was asking and whether she shouldn't have been there. Our prince was already chastising himself for asking this, and then he thought that his brother was checking on him, being sure that our heroine was in her room after all. Raven assumed that she had escaped and immediately remembered fragments of his childhood. One day a bird flew out of his cage and he was extremely upset because he thought it would stay with him forever. Even then, he wondered why everyone around him was running away, and now he thought that if things always ended like this, he should chase them away first. And at this time Bourbon intervened in the conversation and addressed his master with the word that he wanted to inform about it later, but decided to say now, and said that there was an empty room in the Duke's estate, which belonged to someone. The knight stated that in his opinion, this room was prepared for a woman, and then added that when they made a portrait of the author, it turned out that it was a girl. Bourbon continued to speak and this time suggested that the Duke was hiding something. Before the Crown Prince could turn to our prince, he took his sword from its scabbard and went forward. In addition, he asked him to find a new bodyguard. Our prince immediately began to attack the verbose Bourbon, and he, although he defended himself, soon lost his sword, and the rest of the guard rushed away. The guard began to ask for mercy from his master, realizing that his end had come. At that moment, our heroine and her assistant were just reaching the mansion, and Angela was happy that she returned to the estate without any problems. When they immediately became witnesses of violent events, and as a result, they received a wrapped sword in a box with cookies that they brought. Bourbon was on the verge of execution, and the Elridges turned to our heroine and asked what they should do to avoid this spectacle. Angela knew right away that they were falling for each other, especially when she met our prince's gaze, and while the assistant begged the cookie not to die, our heroine blamed herself for not thinking of going through the back door. Frederick, meanwhile, approached Raven and informed him that this girl was the same person he saw on the street and wondered if she was staying at the estate, while Mono lamented that it all happened at the most inopportune moment. Kronprince said that he thought she was a very interesting person and expressed a desire to get to know her. At this time, one of the employees addressed our heroine as a scientist and asked her where she was going. Now everyone was wondering who would give the explanation and what it all meant and how it would all end, and the maids even brought popcorn because the situation promised to be interesting. When the Crown Prince inquired as to what kind of scholar she was, Raven replied that his librarian needed an assistant, so this girl was brought in as his assistant. Frederick found his explanation extremely interesting, but decided not to watch the concert anymore and apologized for the commotion and promised to control his nights better. The Crown Prince asked Raven not to see him off, but on the contrary to rest, because it was obvious how tired he was. Frederick expressed his hope that the new scientist would also come to the celebration in honor of the victory and said that he wanted to congratulate our heroine properly. The Crown Prince said that the two of them simply had to be present at this event. Our heroine saw how Mono signaled to her that he would take care of everything himself, and she should take her feet in her hands and go to her room. The prince's bodyguard was chastising himself for having to watch over the author, and now admitting his mistake of oversight, he then approached the prince and asked if he was all right. Raven sat and remembered how he had told his sister that they would definitely return, referring to both his people and his Shirando. Hoya then asked why they should return to him and said that he really believed that someone would return to them. The sister asked her brother not to be a weakling and said that they had only them. His thoughts were interrupted by our heroine, who brought a box of cookies and said that she bought him a present, but he had a small accident. Although, to be honest, she bought him a gift with his own money, and Mono, distracted by his assistant, still thought that maybe now was a good time for sweets. Our heroine asked the prince if everything was all right with him, and admitted that she did not pay attention to the fact that people from the imperial palace were here, so she entered through the main gate. Mono saw that his master was in a terrible mood now, but he could not stop the girl, and she asked the prince that, perhaps, it was not because of her sudden appearance that the situation became complicated. Raven was glad that at least she realized this, which he stated sternly, handing her a portrait of herself. Then the prince told her to go, but first to take her offerings and go inside with them. Our heroine could not believe that it was she who was drawn on this picture, and her assistant found the drawing extremely successful, where Angela is a direct cast copy. Meanwhile, the prince asked the assistant where she got this dress and specified her name. Raven ordered his assistant to be careful not to let this happen again, after which they left for the mansion. But none of them suspected that someone else was watching everything that was happening and even made sketches, saying that today he definitely saw something worth a lot of money. The Crown Prince asked his aide if he was all right, and in response he heard words of apology for the fact that his master was forced to look at the weakness of his bodyguard, and he in response emphasized that the Duke was the strongest man in the Empire, so in that, what happened is nothing surprising. Frederick asked Bourbon if there was anything special about the room he saw, and the young man replied that it was completely empty, and suggested that perhaps the girl had not been able to bring her things because she was in a hurry, or she had nothing at all, and the Crown Prince assumed that both one and the other were possible. Frederick also asked his guard not to talk more about his weakness because he was doing very well and asked the knight not to worry and to do as his heart dictated. It was already the fourth day after that confusion, and somehow Mono addressed our heroine with the fact that she will have to add to her future work, even though it will be exhausting. Among other things, her assistant arranged a tour of the mansion and immediately pointed out that it was full of mice and that it was necessary to look in both eyes. Our heroine noticed that everything around had a stunning appearance and noted that the servants were kind to her. One of the best parts of staying at this mansion was the amazing and insanely delicious food, and even though she wasn't sure she deserved it, she still enjoyed it, even though a few days ago about such a life she could not even dream. Other maids constantly asked our heroine's assistant about various details. Our heroine concluded that although her assistant was worried about not being able to adjust to life in the mansion, now after the recent event, she had become very popular among the maids because she was the main witness, and Angela thought that now she only had to worry about myself. Soon, our heroine was shown her study, which was located in the library, and here she could secretly work on the continuation of the novel. In the rest of the time she had to help the librarian, although there were incidents in the form of falls from the stairs. But be that as it may, in such grateful conditions, our heroine began work on the continuation of her novel. and everything would be good, but Angela found that she had a real creative crisis. And she came to this conclusion because she herself spent half a day trying to squeeze 2 words out of her and thought that from one attempt to write in the old styles of her Paris mesh. At one point, our heroine completely despaired and thought that she was slowly going crazy, and later came to the conclusion that after that incident the prince did not leave his room, so she did not have the opportunity to meet him, which led to her loss of inspiration. Angela recalled that at home she was okay with fantasizing about his portraits drawn by the paparazzi, but here she just stared into the void and it was difficult for her. And the assistant's drawings didn't help her much, and she thought about the fact that, most likely, after returning from the war, a lot of things fell on him, and since he didn't even have a chance to rest, he was probably very tired. Our heroine remembered that he went to rescue her, so to speak, the very night he returned, and after that he had to take care of many other things. Then she remembered the crown prince and thought about seeing him for the first time, while noting that he was also a real handsome man. If we take this into account, then the image of the good-natured crown prince corresponds to the image of the heir whom she always imagined, but when she met him in life, everything turned out to be somewhat different. As it turned out, our hero prince swings his sword for any reason and even for no reason. And our heroine came to the conclusion that in order to write something good, she should be a fanatic, and not remember and immerse herself in some scary fragments of the past. But then the girl came to another conclusion, that no matter what, the prince still smiled, and decided that if he had a dimple like the princess's, then he would have a very cute appearance. Our heroine sincerely wanted him to smile again, and she daydreamed to such an extent that she fell asleep. Manhwa woke Angela up and said that he and the librarian would take care of things themselves today, and she could go back to her place and rest. When our heroine walked down the corridor, she noticed that the light in the prince's room was not on, and the girl assumed that he had finally gone somewhere. She also noticed that the gardener, who usually takes care of the trees at this time, was also absent. Angela deduced that the prince was now in his office and immediately saw light seeping through the cracks. Our heroine decided to just look at him a little, but she was burned for this obscene matter. Manhwa immediately asked the girl if she had written anything today, but our heroine was a little upset that it was not the one she expected to see here. Then Angela admitted that she just saw the light and looked in, and here sat the assistant of the prince and dealt with the work papers that had accumulated at the duke during his absence. The young man admitted that, with the exception of important matters, he deals with all this in his absence, and our heroine came to the conclusion that the picture presented to her can be called dying, but doing, and she felt sorry for this guy. Then Manhwa said that it was time for him to take a break and asked the girl what was the reason for her visit to the prince. When our heroine confessed that she assumed that the prince had finally left his apartments, she heard that he had gone to an important meeting this morning, and as he did not like the extra commotion in the estate about his departure, he left by the back passage. The girl was even a little upset, because she wanted to see him, and the assistant noticed this and invited her to sit down, although the bourbon sword was still lying there, and then informed her that he noticed that our heroine had spent quite a lot on purchases, and added that he had seen this quite a bill. Angela stated that she would return the money in the process of work, and the young man replied that this would be considered compensation for her hard work on the novel. Then Manhwa asked the girl how the work was progressing, and added that the prince, after he rested, would definitely read the manuscript, as he planned to do it periodically. Our heroine did not know how to confess her creative stagnation at all, and decided to simply ask if he had portraits of the prince that were taken by the paparazzi, and this request somewhat confused the young man. Angela then confessed that she had been looking at the picture at home and writing the novel, inspired by them and using her imagination. And now that she could not see the prince at all, she thought that a few portraits might help her, and immediately assumed that Manhwa, of course, does not have them. Then the prince's bodyguard explained to our heroine that the duke hated paparazzi artists, and reminded her that she had seen him a few days ago and asked if it would help her. Then the girl explained that the fact is that he was too different from what she imagined him to be, and the young man had to simply sympathize with her. And then Manhwa had an idea, especially when he remembered that his master smiled when he looked at our heroine. Then the prince's assistant offered the girl to help him cope with this mountain of work, and when the duke returned, she should bring him a report on the work he had done on today's documents. Our heroine immediately began to rush, and the young man assumed that the prince's condition had improved in these few days and asked to say hello to him and tell him how the work on the novel was progressing. And when he saw that the girl hesitated, he said that if it was difficult for her to do it, then he could tell him everything himself. Then our heroine got a hold of herself and declared that it was simple, and Manhwa just breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that he now had one less problem. Although then the young man began to worry about whether it was really worth sending her alone, and stopped at the decision that he would do so once the prince smiled at her. When night fell over the area, the head maid decided to check before going to sleep whether the black passage was closed, but soon discovered a rider with a horse. The woman immediately began to find out who it was and what he needed, but the man asked her not to shout and named himself. The maid began to apologize and said that she did not even know that he was leaving, and in the meantime, various gifts from female fans jingled and rustled under his feet. Raven began to get angry at the number of these bunnies and bear cubs that were stuffed into him, and simply wondered where the scientist was now. The prince got to his room and collected another pile of gifts from the fans and decided that he would order to get rid of all this junk a little later, and he himself looked at the book and did not understand what was so special about it. He thought that now he could not even appear in public places without an urgent need, and it was tiring because he had to ask someone for help. The prince recalled how the chancellor had approached him and was surprised to see him here instead of his sister. And then Raven explained that Hoya was busy with business, and the chancellor responded by asking if the crown prince had happened to visit him at the mansion recently. He handed Raven a sheet of paparazzi sketch of their meeting, then added that it looked like he was too focused on the trivial incident with the writing when he was already able to be sketched out on this smear. The prince was very surprised that someone was watching over them and did not understand at all how it happened, although he was aware that he had one more problem. And the chancellor, at the same time, noted that from his expression it was clear that he also did not notice anyone, and therefore relaxed too much. The chancellor expressed his hope that no matter what, the prince should get rid of these parasites and noted that he had nothing to do in the near future, and Raven promised that he would be more careful. And then he added that the chancellor shouldn't be too interested in other people's lives either, because it makes him look like those people. The prince suggested that the chancellor spend his free time training instead. And finally, he added that next time it might not be a simple wound, and the man mentally called him a freak. He barely restrained himself, and in the meantime the guard came up and announced that they were ready to leave. When the chancellor mounted his horse, he simply declared that our prince was the same as always, and said goodbye until the next meeting. As soon as the gates opened and it was announced that the commander-in-chief was leaving, the people began to eagerly await their hero. The crowd immediately rushed inside and the chancellor barely managed to shout. But his horse was knocked down and the man himself fell to the ground with screams. Where did this crowd suddenly come from? The fans immediately noticed our prince and began to give him gifts and draw his attention to them. People chanted the name of their hero and asked him to sign the book. While the prince showed a desire to kill our heroine, the chancellor tried to understand what was going on and how these bastards dared to show such brutality towards him. The chancellor drew attention to the fact that these were ordinary townspeople and asked the knights not to spoil the hard-earned image of their family and stop the massacre attempt by his soldiers. At this moment, he was also noticed and the commoners determined that he was a representative of the Schwendel family. And they began to discuss that if they passed by and did not notice, it could lead to trouble, and our prince continued to be teased from all sides, and even the guard intervened. People also whispered that they hadn't noticed how creepy the chancellor looked before, and talked about how a few days ago the crown prince's bodyguard was even brandishing a sword in the city. And then the chancellor heard people say that he had to be careful, because his family really could turn out to be dangerous, as the novel says. After all that had happened, our prince was sitting in his apartment reading the same novel while Manhwa was finishing his work until he was distracted by the maid. The prince's aide told the maid that it was time for her to rest, but the lady replied that he could do with a nap too, and then said that the duke had already returned. Manhwa assumed that our heroine had probably already seen him without any problems. Meanwhile, the senior maid indignantly declared that the prince's assistant should have informed her that His Highness was leaving the mansion, as it had come as a surprise to her. The woman then revealed that the prince was looking for a scientist, and his aide thought about Raven looking for her even though it was night. Though he was then stunned by the maid saying that the prince was going to find the girl and finish her off. Manhwa was upset that he was only being told this now, and the woman then explained that she had decided the scientist was asleep. So she had taken to catching mice and had just quit now, before stating that the mice weren't going away because he was making such a mess here. The senior maid was proud to have caught almost 10 mice. Manhwa frantically counted that one mouse was caught for about 5 minutes and was now horrified by how much time he had lost and what could have happened. And our heroine went to the prince and fought with her fear because she was going to see him for the first time after her arrival in the mansion. Raven finally understood why Frederick was stressing over the book, and decided that there was a clever point in the text after all, even though most of it was, in his opinion, selective nonsense. The prince also found references to the Schwendel family, and now it became clear to him why the chancellor had said such things to him and behaved in such a manner. Raven concluded that this book would bring a lot of problems if we delved into the description of the imperial family, and at this time our heroine knocked on his door and he asked to enter. At first, the prince choked on his tea, and then he began to think why this girl was here, and our heroine was already admiring the image of the cute prince in pajamas and mentally thanked Manhwa for this chance given to her. Angela was very nervous and even the crackling of the flaming board seemed terribly loud to her, but then she pulled herself together and asked the prince how he rested. The man was extremely shocked by this encounter and only thought about how it was that our heroine did not receive a message from the head maid, and then suggested that maybe she just had the nerve to behave in this way. Angela stated that his assistant asked her to bring the report, and the prince decided that even Manhwa didn't know anything. Raven asked to put the report on the table, and he thought that if his assistant sent it, then the girl had something to say to him. Our heroine assumed that the prince was in a bad mood and thought that she should have waited until the next time to ask about what she wanted. On the other hand, the girl wanted to talk about her case without witnesses, so she decided that she could hardly ask about the affair now, so she decided to leave. But the prince offered to sit down and say what she had come for, though he regretted saying it afterwards, for he wanted her to sit down in the chair that was next to him, and turned away, barely restraining himself. Our heroine came to the idea that she would just blurt out something at random and quickly escape from this room, so she firmly declared that the estate was plagued by mice, and then she noticed her book on the floor. Angela realized that he had just read her and it made her feel good. Then the girl told the prince that before she said anything else, she had one question that had been bothering her ever since they met, and the prince replied that that must be the reason she came, so offered to speak faster. And then our heroine looked at Raven and directly asked him if he remembered her, and reminded her that they took care of the Shirando bird together. Our prince immediately remembered fragments from his childhood, especially those where he was playing with his bird and girlfriend. In those days, he was still the crown prince, and in the memories of our heroine, he remained the one who, according to rumors, killed the second empress, so she ran away. Raven reached out to her and asked her how she could ask if he remembered, and then asked her what she was implying with such a question. He grabbed our heroine and began to demand an answer, but the girl decided that they were too close to each other, and on top of that, she couldn't speak because of her clenched jaw, so she didn't say anything. Then our heroine decided that such closeness between them was inappropriate and decided to push the prince away from her a little, using considerable force. Our poor prince squirmed, being completely confused about the situation, and our heroine concluded that she must have gone mad, and began to apologize for embarrassing herself, blaming everything on too much intimacy. Angela asked if he was okay and if he wasn't angry, and decided to return to the subject of the novel, after which she asked if any parts of the story seemed familiar to him. Our heroine immediately found several pages and asked the prince to pay attention to them, but the young man stopped her and asked to talk about it next time. Our saddened heroine agreed, and she herself thought that everything was so bad that it couldn't be worse and couldn't believe that she had punched him in the stomach after seeing him for the first time in days. She was depressed also because now she did not know when she would get another chance to be alone with him, and she even decided that he would avoid her now. Then the prince said that he would visit her tomorrow, because it was late today and everyone needed to rest, and offered to talk later. And our heroine now knew no bounds to her joy, and the young man just in case covered his stomach this time so as not to receive another blow. The girl was very worried that the prince was angry, and in parting she joyfully wished him a good rest. And even in spite of what happened, our heroine was happy and was already thinking about wearing something like that tomorrow in order to have an attractive appearance. But at that moment, the door suddenly opened and just as suddenly slammed into her forehead. The bewildered Mono ran to save our heroine and lost his strength a little, and now he asked the girl if everything is okay with her, and she said that from now on she is a little not quite normal, and then she replied that everything is fine with her and said goodbye until tomorrow. Then the assistant turned his attention to his master and apologized for such a sudden visit, then admitted that he was just worried about them and wished him a good rest. At the same time, Mono noticed that the prince had not read the letter that came from Hoya and then decided to tell Raven that his sister would come to the mansion soon. And since the princess knew that her brother would not be in a hurry to read her letter, she sent a duplicate to his assistant. Suddenly the prince turned to his assistant and asked him if he remembered Shirando, and the young man replied that it was a bird he had raised when he was still a child. The prince then asked Mono if it was true that she had run away, and the young man replied that he was not sure. The assistant again reminded that Mrs. Hoya would visit the mansion tomorrow, and then the prince told him to finish his work and go to rest. Even then he noticed a pile of toys and thought that he should get rid of them, but the assistant had already left and decided not to call him, because he had not rested for several days already. The chancellor, in turn, went to visit the crown prince and asked the knights to guard him well so that he would be at peace. The guard led him into the crown prince's apartments, and he repeated again that they should keep trying. When the man was left alone with the prince, the young man just had time to ask what brought him here at such a late hour. When the chancellor declared that he was very lucky, and then grabbed him by the shirt and asked if he had thought of playing games. The chancellor asked the crown prince if he knew what he had seen today, and added that now was not the time for him to sit here like a fool. Meanwhile, Bourbon appeared from the shadows, and the chancellor told him that he was standing far away and drawing his sword, and that he had no brains at all, and added that the knight should immediately leave the room if he did not wish to die. Frederick then reproached the chancellor that he should not have looked into his room at such a late hour, since his bride might be there, and asked if something bad had happened. The man swung to hit him, at which point the boy flashed back to his childhood memories of being hit the same way, and the boy replied that he could see how he was afraid of something like that. The crown prince could barely contain himself, and the chancellor, in his turn, declared that he could not even control his guards, and then added that time was passing and Raven was gathering strength, and he was still the same fool. Then the man said that if his mother were alive, she would be disappointed in her son. The chancellor turned angrily to the prince and reminded him that his mother had been his sister before she became his mother, and remarked that he knew what she wanted for him and asked him not to be rude in return. Frederick thought to himself that he was acting like his father and wondered aloud what had brought him to him. The chancellor said plainly that he was troubled with that vulgar book of which there was so much talk, and asked why he could not attend to it, when that was all the business he had been occupied with for the last few days, and inquired if he knew what he was dealing with, had to face because of it. The prince thought to himself again that the chancellor hadn't even thought of listening to him before, and he concluded that at last his uncle understood that everything was serious, and he announced in his voice that he had found out that the real author of this edition was now living in the mansion Raven. Frederick also said that he had forced the girl to come to the party so she would show up at the palace on her own, to which the Chancellor said that his actions were driving him mad and began to insist that he should just kill her. Then the prince said that if rumors of the murder were to spread just now, things would only get worse, because public opinion was currently revolving around this novel. So it was not so easy to do, and suggested that the author would be very useful if she joined them, but expressed his intention that he just needs to tie her to him. The man thought about it, then stated that it would be quite difficult to do that, especially if Raven started to have feelings for her, and advised him to take care of it before it was too late. And our heroine stood on the balcony and thought about the fact that even in the mansion at night it gets cool. Then she thought back to her conversation with the prince and admitted that it was far more important that he looked like he remembered her. But she noticed that he was deliberately trying not to show it and assumed that his memories of time, which they spent together, were bad for him. Angela remembered his expression and she thought that he was definitely not angry, and she imagined this handsome man again and decided that tomorrow, during their conversation, she would finally find out everything, and she went back to thinking about what outfit she should choose. At that moment, another friend joined our heroine, but the girl decided to part with her company right away, and to be honest, it was even more out of fear. Her screams were heard by the prince, who immediately grabbed his sword and was already chastising himself for leaving the author without protection, especially when even the Chancellor intervened in this matter. With the thought of what a fool he is, the prince rushed to our heroine for help. Manhwa also ran out to save a girl who was yelling something about some pervert. Our heroine held a man by the collar and screamed at the top of her voice that she had caught a pervert, while the man demanded that the girl return his goods to him. While the prince and his assistant were figuring out what was going on here, our heroine got into a fight with a stranger, and at the same time explained that she pushed a mouse, which scared the pervert with its flight, which in turn flew to the balcony. The girl asked for help, and the stranger, meeting the prince's eyes, decided to sacrifice the bag and better run away. Angela yelled after him to stop, and Manhwa rushed to catch up with him, resenting that he was losing precious sleep time to him, while the maids repopped their popcorn and watched the events unfold in the mansion while they savored it. Our heroine was already berating herself for the prince's assistant chasing this guy because of her, and then Raven explained that even if it wasn't for her, they would still have to arrest him for trespassing. The principal inquired whether there were no other suspicious persons and heard a negative answer, and he himself thought that because of his nerves and this strange situation he could not get a good view of the face of the uninvited visitor. Our heroine said that she managed to beat off his bag and let the prince see it. The young man immediately concluded that the owner of this bag was obviously too clumsy to be a hired assassin sent by the Chancellor. From the content, the prince concluded that this guy was a paparazzi. Then the prince noticed a drawing where he was holding our heroine's face and wondered if he really looked like that at that moment. At this point, Manhwa stated that he dropped him at the black entrance and assumed that the boy had run into town and decided to take a horse and give chase. The prince thought that his assistant was too sleepy, so he missed him, although there was nothing strange in this, because the young man had not slept for several days, so he told him to go and rest. And he himself began to think that another problem had arisen and began to think that if he was able to hide his presence so well in order to make these sketches, then he must be exactly the artist the Chancellor had told him about. Raven figured that if the Chancellor found out they missed this paparazzi, he'd probably come up with something else. Our heroine also thought about this situation and thought about the fact that she met the paparazzi for the first time. Suddenly, the girl screamed again in shock, and the prince immediately went into a defensive posture, and then Angela declared that they should catch him immediately, and she would personally go after him, as she recognized this style of sketching. Our heroine saw an absolute similarity with those drawings that were in her room and thought that if she had sketches of this guy, then she would not have to worry about the novel and said that it was very important to her. Angela also reminded that she had seen his face, so she would definitely be able to recognize him, and the prince agreed. On the other hand, he understood that the situation was extremely risky and he could not send her alone, while this artist could not be missed, and he did not know what else he could see. Raven looked at Manhwa and realized that he couldn't go anywhere in this state, because he needed to rest, and decided to send the authoress and several knights to search for him in the morning. Then he remembered the words of his sister, who said that this was a very important period for them and reminded him that he should guard the estate well. After that, the prince decided that he would go alone, and our heroine would be with him. When Angela questioned, Raven replied that they would catch him before sunrise and asked if she didn't mind going to bed a little later than usual. When our couple advanced on their mission, Angela tried to tell the prince that Manhwa had fallen asleep standing up, to which she was told that it was his problem. Despite the fact that it was night, the streets were well lit at the same time and the prince asked our heroine to cover her face. And at that moment the girl thought that it might even be something like a secret meeting, although she later turned her thoughts back. Angela asked Raven how they were going to look for him and assumed that they would be walking the streets, and then the prince replied that he would find him immediately if he saw him face to face. But since he had to rely on his instincts, it would take time, and it will only require identification based on external similarity. Our heroine concluded that the prince was really stressed by this whole situation, although on the other hand, he always had to deal with a lot of threats because of all these terrible rumors. So she thought that now he had to protect not only the imperial family, but also her, so he was full of worries and she even felt a little sorry for him. The girl noticed that he was wandering here and there and wondered if it would continue like this, after which she suggested that the prince go to the center of the city. Raven said that it was too bright and crowded, and added that it was dangerous in such places, and our heroine said that if she were in that boy's place, she would just go to the place where there are a lot of people. Angela reminded the prince that the boy had lost his bag, and therefore, being upset, would surely have gone to disperse. The girl told Raven that if he was bothered by the sideways glances, then he shouldn't be too worried, because a lot more people like him than he might think. The prince reasoned that all this could change in an instant, as people are easily influenced by others, and concluded that his companion was too naive. Nevertheless, the young man decided to act according to the plan of our heroine, only he warned that they would not stay there. The prince, worried about the past situation, hid from the people and did not understand why such a crowd had gathered here at such a time. At one point, Raven stopped the girl and told her that it was dangerous and asked her not to go too far away from him, at which point our heroine realized how unhappy this person was and asked him not to worry and not to worry about anything and to trust her. Our heroine immediately ran into the thick of events and called the prince after her, and he only had time to think, did she come here just for fun? Raven understood that he had to be alert and watch everything around him, if only because the assassin sent by the chancellor might be here, although everyone present seemed suspicious to him. The prince already regretted that he had not left our heroine in the mansion, and thought that it would be much easier for him to handle this matter himself, and decided that he should look around as soon as possible and find the paparazzi. At some point, the young man heard the explosions and took a defensive position, protecting our heroine, but it was just a sudden firework. And then the girl realized that the prince was really worried as hell and decided to immediately find out if everything was okay, and offered to continue the inspection of those present. Raven, in turn, came to the conclusion that protecting our heroine turned out to be really exhausting, and in her voice told the girl to follow the people who surrounded her, and added that they should hurry and find the artist. But our heroine was in no hurry and simply apologized to the prince for being late, justifying her behavior by the fact that she had not seen fireworks for a long time. Soon the girl saw a local tourist center dedicated to the prince, and realized that it is not surprising that there are so many people here. Angela concluded that the city comes alive at night, when the probability of attracting the prince's attention is less, and decided that it would be necessary to somehow look here with her assistant. At this point, people discovered the prince, but the man was an imposter offering hugs to fellow fans. Our heroine found this situation amusing and asked the prince to pay attention to how many people love him. Raven declared that it was a disgusting sight and offered to go somewhere quieter. They went to the nearest tavern, and the girl noted that when she came here with her assistant, it was much quieter here. The waiter immediately brought them each a glass of beer, and our heroine, meanwhile, remarked that she had the impression that it was as if everyone had come here on purpose when she invited him to this place, and then added that people were a little out of bounds, expressing their love, but they do it out of admiration for him. And then the girl admitted that she would also tense up if someone on the street suddenly started taking pictures of her. Some of those in attendance became resentful of the noise emanating from the fanatical gathering place, and resented that the city was mired in confusion. They started discussing the cursed piece of paper, referring to our heroine's book, and also couldn't understand why people were so fascinated by this hypocritical snob, referring to our prince. The men recalled those rumors that spoke of the cruelty of the prince and how it was said earlier that he buried his prisoners alive underground. They were indignant that the book had completely changed public opinion about these imperial twins, and our heroine was about to stand up and stab each of them, and the prince replied that it was true. Raven said that every time he went to war, everyone just wished him dead. When he was wounded and returned, the people regretted that his wounds were not deep enough. The prince stated that these same people now cling to him with their arms and admitted that he cannot think positively of them if they change their minds so quickly. Our heroine became angry and declared that all these rumors about him were baseless, and said that she believed that he did not kill the empress, and added that, belatedly, at least now the rumors are going in the right direction. When the prince inquired of the girl what if all this was true and these new rumors that were spreading now also had no basis, and asked what she would do if all the past rumors that she so denied were not really lies, our heroine caught herself thinking that she had completely forgotten how creepy this person could be at times, and the prince saw her confusion at that moment. And he himself thought that a few words had brought her to such a state, and wondered where it came from. All her confidence took off. He came to the conclusion that it seems that his interlocutor is no different from others. At that moment, a young man asked the hostess to allow him to borrow a room and said that he was completely broke now, but emphasized that he would pay the entire debt tomorrow. The prince paid attention to the fight that was taking place behind him, while the man, meanwhile, declared that he would paint them a picture for money. Raven immediately asked our heroine to look at that man, because he assumed that he was the one they needed, while the girl was thinking about why she trusted the prince completely again. Angela's thoughts were interrupted by a guy who offered the girl that he could draw her so that she wouldn't look like a monster. And our heroine recognized in this guy the same paparazzi who ran away from her, and similarly, he also recognized the same girl who had taken his bag away from him. In a matter of seconds, the prince reacted and already pressed him against the wall, and the boy, although he was shouting, was thinking about where they had come from and why the prince had come in his own person, instead of sending his knight here. Raven reproached our heroine that she did not understand what she was doing, and they almost missed him, to which the girl replied that she was thinking about something of her own. People started coming up to them and asking what was the matter, to which Angela said that they were just saying hello to an old friend and promised to be quiet from now on. The prince, meanwhile, told the boy to shut up and follow him, as he did not want to make a scene in public. But the next moment, the paparazzi shouted that Prince Raven was here in his own person, and people immediately began to pay attention to our hero, discovering that this is far from a fake, but a real prince. The reaction of others was immediate, and it gave the paparazzi an opportunity to hide. And at the moment when our heroine decided to run after him, the prince, flattered by the attention, asked not to walk alone, because it is dangerous, although he himself could not escape from the embrace of those around him. Angela managed to catch up with the paparazzi, but her condition left much to be desired, and even the guy admitted that if someone saw her now, they might think that he really beat her, and wondered why she jumped off the edge after him in the first place, when there are absolutely normal stairs, and inquired whether she thought she had the same data as our knight. The young man also stated that it was not that he felt sorry for her, but he would still listen to her, because she stubbornly continued to pursue him, and noted that if he understood why the prince was doing it, then why she was doing it, he can't wait. Our heroine grabbed the boy by his clothes and declared that he was a sneaky kid who finally got her hands on him, even though he just wanted to offer help to get the girl up. The young man assumed in his voice that some brat was trying to deceive him, and then Angela stood up and declared that she was actually taller than him. Our heroine immediately asked him if he is the paparazzi named Blaine who only follows Prince Raven, and in response she heard if she knew him. Angela then admitted that she was a big fan of his drawings and apologized for calling him a pervert the previous meeting. Our heroine also admitted to the guy that she started collecting his drawings 5 years ago and only thanks to them she could be fanatical about the prince. And Blaine, in turn, admitted that his drawings with the image of the prince weren't selling so well then, and thanked girl for evaluating his work. Blaine wondered how our heroine became a fan of the prince when no one liked him, and added that at the time there were all these sinister rumors about him, and our heroine immediately remembered the prince's question about what, if all this is true. Angela replied that that's why she chased after him, because she wanted to make sure of something. But at that time they were already being watched by a hired killer who came after the soul of our heroine and believed that now was the best chance to fulfill the order, especially since the prince was not with the girl, but he was stopped by the fact that there was always someone nearby. The mercenary decided that he would just finish off our heroine with this boy before it was too late, but he came across a soft toy. At that moment, the killer heard a familiar voice saying that he had allowed such a turn of events, but now saw with his own eyes that the Chancellor had indeed sent the killer. The prince put his sword to the mercenary's neck and wondered if the Chancellor was still bright with his mind. Raven thought about the fact that he was only protecting the author because of his sister's request, but he noticed that she was no different from the rest of the others and only annoyed him, and even began to hesitate as to whether he had done the right thing by not pretending not to see her and didn't go away. And Blaine tried to clarify for himself what our heroine wanted to make sure of. Angela hesitantly asked about those portraits of the prince he was drawing all the time. The girl asked the boy if he really saw all the things he drew, and said that he even had drawings from the battlefield, and asked if he had made them up. Blaine immediately indignantly stated who she thought he was, and asked if she thought he was faking them or was faking them, and emphasized that no matter how hard he was pressed by circumstances, he wasn't making anything up, he was only drawing what was saw with my own eyes. He also said that he only got into it in the first place because he decided that working in a small genre that others didn't do could turn out to be unexpectedly profitable, and then admitted that because of those bad rumors about the prince, he never managed to get rich. Then Blaine, thinking about how to escape from our heroine, added that he was going to stop this field of activity in general and start following and depicting another object. But then he remarked that, judging by his drawings, the prince turned out to be a really interesting model, so he continued to draw it. Our heroine felt the most contradictory feelings, and when the boy asked why she was crying, the girl answered that it was not so, but she was just afraid that she would have to stop being fanatical about the prince. Angela said that she constantly hears some nightmare fiction about him, and he doesn't even try to deny it. And here it is necessary to make a remark that our prince was an invisible witness of this conversation. And our heroine continued to say that if it did not sound like an absolute delusion, but she is sure that the prince is a good person. The girl wished people wouldn't get too hung up on the rumors and just believe in him, like she did after seeing his drawings, which Blaine had told her about. Then Angela told the boy that his works could be very useful and asked if he could help them. And the young man thought that of course you can thank him for such words, but for the prince, the paparazzi is just a stick in the ass, and he does not will allow. The girl also said that the prince recently encountered his fans, but avoided meeting them. She noticed that he turned and walked away from those who were admiring him, and she admitted that it looked pretty awful. Our heroine emphasized that it seemed to her that he was trying to push people away from him before they would turn away from him because of another false scandal. And it should be noted that our prince, as before, remained a witness to this conversation that took place between the author and the paparazzi. Angela expressed a desire to protect Raven from all kinds of strange rumors, and then asked Blaine how he felt about her purpose and asked for his help. And he immediately replied that he didn't know anything and asked her to deal with all her affairs herself, to which our heroine declared where his loyalty had been lost and heard back that he was seeing her for the first time today. Of course, our prince was pleased to hear this conversation and he even involuntarily smiled, and the mercenary, meanwhile, thought that while the prince was distracted, he could take advantage of the opportunity and run away. The assassin noticed that Raven had lost his vigilance and could have been killed several times already and even wondered if maybe he should do it. The mercenary decided to end Espellin's family with his own hands and rushed at the prince with a dagger, but he did not know that our prince was watching him in the reflection of his sword and was ready to repel his attack. In a few seconds, the assassin's dagger flew from the cobblestones right at our author and the talking paparazzi, and the prince pulled the mask off the mercenary and at the same time held him close to death, and himself offered the choice of dying or delivering a message to the chancellor. Raven kindly asked him to pass it on to his employer, so that he would put out of his mind any idea of how to harm the author, and if he ever thought of threatening her again, he would not let it go from his hands. Of course, the mercenary chose life and rushed to deliver a message to the chancellor, while our heroine in the meantime escaped on the stairs and added another fragment to her collection of strange moments with the prince, and was also noticed by him and exposed in the eavesdropping, after which she declared that I didn't do anything like that, but it just happened that way. And then our heroine decided to find out for herself what happened to that man and the threats, and asked the prince to come to an understanding. Then Raven gave a short negative answer to her question, and the girl thought to herself that it was because he didn't explain anything until now that all these misunderstandings and rumors arose, because people just believed what they saw with their own eyes. Angela assumed in her voice that he did so for her protection and thanked her, and then said that he could not say anything more, because she herself would reveal the true meaning of his actions. Our heroine put the mercenary's dagger on the cobblestones and added that she would do it so that other people would not be so easily led by various ridiculous rumors, because she believes him. The prince again answered in one word that he was interested in it and threw the dagger away. Then he came to our heroine and held out his hand to help her up, and he pulled her like that turnip from the garden. The girl immediately found herself in his arms, and the prince approached her and declared that she should not trust him so much and explained his statement by the fact that he definitely does not trust her. And then he also saw that our heroine missed the paparazzi. The mercenary managed to escape and he now thought that he was on the verge of death, but the prince somehow left him alive, and then even admired his powers and abilities. Presently Bourbon, who was standing in the courtyard, called out to him, and asked him about a message for the chancellor, supposing that this was the reason why he was in such a hurry. The mercenary immediately said that Prince Raven had warned the chancellor that he would not tolerate threats against the author, and added that his thirst for blood was quite great, and that he looked as if he were ready without thinking to rush upon the Lord Chancellor and kill him, whereupon Bourbon approached him and killed him with one blow. Already in the morning, our heroine was telling Manhwa how she and the prince caught the paparazzi and how he shared his stash with her, and the assistant regretted that he fell asleep and overslept. The young man asked if his master had spared him this artist, and the girl enthusiastically replied that of course he had. Manhwa noted that paparazzi activities and trespassing on the Duke's private property for the purpose of espionage in general is a serious crime and emphasized that it was quite a gracious gesture on the part of the prince. And our heroine did not agree at all, because she was completely in the grip of memories, where the prince grabbed her in his arms and at one point did not even hold back and exclaimed that he was cool. Manhwa asked the girl if she had fallen asleep in the library, and our heroine admitted that she had been writing almost all night, although a drawing was imprinted on her forehead and she was now diligently erasing it. The prince's assistant made his conclusions, which were focused on the fact that his master likes the scientist very much and she behaves like a real child. After that, Manhwa thought that in any case he was glad that the matter was already resolved, but still he needed to make sure of everything himself and make sure that the paparazzi would keep his mouth shut, and wondered why he was being accompanied, the feeling that he missed something. Soon they were told that the princess had arrived at the mansion and everyone needed to show up to meet her. The prince's assistant was completely confused because he was waiting for Hoya on another day. The princess immediately noticed how quiet the mansion was and asked where her brother was, and then she turned all her attention to our heroine and began to take an interest in the matters of composing the novel, and the girl replied that she was going to start it soon. And when the princess heard this answer, she decided to inquire what they were doing here all this time. To which our heroine replied that she had been looking for a suitable plot all this time, and now she finally found it and was ready to start writing the story. Angela suggested as a plot the story of a night search for the paparazzi in the center of the city, in which the prince participated, to which the princess reacted favorably, and both young men recognized this idea as truly delusional. Raven immediately broke into the conversation and told her sister that she didn't tell her she was coming today, and since he was busy, it was time for him to go. Hoya remarked that she had just arrived a day earlier than expected and asked what he didn't like, to which the prince replied that he was fine with it and offered to have fun. The princess told our heroine that she can think about the plot a little more and finally get down to the main business. The sister turned to her brother and remarked that she had heard that Frederick had recently visited his mansion, and then she noticed the sword in that room, which belonged to the crown prince's bodyguard, and assumed that something interesting had happened here. Mono immediately regretted not getting rid of him sooner, and Hoya then said that it concerned everyone and asked the prince's assistant why he did not tell her about it, then added that she was not at all eager to learn important news from others and asked if the rumors did not concern them all. The prince immediately replied that it wasn't something to report to her, but Hoya smiled and asked how things were going with his attendance at the upcoming banquet. The princess said that the whole aristocracy is already gossiping about it and added that there is also information that even the new scholar of the first prince has been invited to the holiday. Hoya directly asked her brother if he was really going to go to this event, and wondered if he did not understand that he had been bitten, and then said that the crown prince had most likely guessed the identity of the author, because he would hardly have shown such an interest to their newfound scientist, and then asked her to refute her words if she was wrong. The sister asked her brother if he really wanted to hide it from her, and reminded her that they had promised each other that there would be no secrets between them, and emphasized that everything that was happening made her very sad. Our heroine intervened in the conversation between the twins and said that in reality everything is much simpler, since she was the one who told the prince that she wanted to go to the banquet. Angela stated that it was of course too cheeky of her, but she really thought that visiting different places would help her find inspiration, and added that she personally begged him to the point that he had to agree. Our heroine expressed confidence that the brother was not going to hide anything from his sister. The girl also stated that he has been so busy lately that yesterday even she saw him for the first time in days, and his assistant had not slept at all for 4 nights in a row. Hoya asked what was going on here, and then, while the prince was wondering, Mono admitted that the author also looked exhausted from her attempts to continue writing the novel. Then the princess looked at each one closely and declared that the banquet was no place for fooling around and having fun, and asked what they would do if they began to be suspected and questioned. Our heroine replied that she understands everything perfectly and added that for her this is a good opportunity to publicly resolve a past misunderstanding, and she will try to prepare carefully so as not to make mistakes. Hoya decided that the girl was too lighthearted about all this and generally assumed that our heroine was fearless, and the prince continued to silently wonder. Even then, Raven responded that our heroine is stubborn and brave, as well as able to easily adapt to any situation, and added that they will be able to prepare her for this event. The prince also asked when this event would take place and learned that they had 5 days left. Raven looked at our heroine and immediately told her to get up and walk, which the girl did. Hoya asked our heroine why she creaks when she walks, and the girl wanted to say that it was because she was nervous, but kept silent. Then the sister turned to her brother and asked him if he could really prepare this girl for the time of the feast. And again our heroine answered, noting that she would need 3 days and a little help from the prince and she would be completely ready. When the princess left them, the room immediately began diligent work on preparing for the upcoming holiday, and our heroine mentally wondered where she got so much self-confidence. Of course, everything fell apart at Angela's and did not work out, and the prince only said that they did not have time and demanded to step again and again. Our heroine looked at this man and thought that if he were not a prince, she would have killed him long ago. The girl took 1 step at a time, but she couldn't admit that her legs hurt a lot after yesterday's walk, so every time she suffered failure after failure, and their number was already infinite. For a moment, our heroine could not stand it and gave up, to which the prince replied that she had asked for help herself, and the girl in response asked him if he didn't have other things to do and reminded her that he had only been studying her all day. Raven replied that he couldn't leave her training to his maids because they didn't know court etiquette, and added that they couldn't hire an expert either because her identity had to be hidden. Our heroine thought that, of course, she was grateful to the prince for such care, but it did not occur to her that he would pay such close attention to her walk, and to be honest, his gaze was so watchful that it even got on her nerves. On the other hand, the girl understood that this was the only way she would not create problems for him, and at that time the prince noticed that her legs were already swollen from training, and noted that she could not cope, but at least she was trying. Tired, Angela picked up the books and continued practicing until the prince decided enough was enough. At this moment, our heroine joyfully exclaimed that she finally managed to hold the book in a hanging position without support. But at the same moment, the young man reminded her that she was wearing shoes now, and on the day of the event she would have to wear heels. And our heroine fell into a state of shock just from one word combination, high heels, not to mention that they would be on her. The The girl was so excited that she twisted her leg, and the prince only had time to think why our heroine is clumsy. At this time, the prince remembered his sister's words when he saw her off, where she said that she did not know how true the girl's words were, but they could not allow the Schwendel family to strike them, and added that if things did not go their way planned, it will be necessary to get rid of the author. Meanwhile, she was lying on the floor and moaning loudly in pain, although she claimed that everything was fine with her. The prince asked our heroine to walk again, and he himself again recalled his sister's instructions that he should not get attached to this girl. As a result, it took 5 hours just to adjust the posture, but still, at least Manhwa praised our heroine, although he mercilessly offered to proceed to the next step immediately, and the girl understood that this was only the beginning. Then there was the acquisition of historical and general information from the librarian about the empire, especially considering that our heroine arrived with no knowledge of that country, and then there were the rules of etiquette, which were also not easily given, and then there was a break, during which everyone engaged in writing. Well, everything ended with training, and again training, and so on to infinity with the next training. The maids were even worried that their ward had never returned from classes, and they themselves, meanwhile, were thinking about the prince. It's just that our heroine spent all night studying again, so all the girls were sent to rest and asked not to wait for her. So the maids began to feel sorry for our heroine that she spends all the time in the library, despite the fact that they were going to go have fun, and none of them even suspected that there was a prince in the garden and became involuntary listeners of this conversation. The man thought that everyone had gone crazy at this banquet and had completely forgotten about the protection of the estate, and no one even paid attention to his absence, and now his presence, and generally his late return. Then he thought that if the crown prince hadn't guessed that he was hiding the author inside himself, then he wouldn't have been invited to this event, and none of them would have had to spend so much time on this nonsense. Raven was annoyed by all of this and thought that even our heroine would be stuck in the library for days when she could just be having fun. And our heroine continued to study in the library, well, almost continued, if you do not take into account the fact that she was already lying exhausted on her arms and, hearing someone come in, thought that it was her assistant and repeated that she would not be able to go with them. But then she saw that it was the prince, who declared that she had better go if she was not going to do something useful anyway. The girl got a nosebleed from fright, and the prince wondered why her nose was bleeding, and our heroine could only think that, as always, it had happened out of place. And then she answered that tomorrow is the deadline for the time by which she should be ready, so she still needs to catch up on some of the book material. Then our heroine assumed that the prince also had a lot to do, but he walked all the way to the library and wondered if he was not tired. And the prince suddenly read on a piece of paper the author's inscription that she wanted to dance at the banquet, but she was unlikely to does it shine. The young man thought for a while, and then he said that she sits inside 4 walls all day and reads books. So it is clear why her nose was bleeding, and told her to get up, and our heroine replied that her conscience does not allow her to sleep. The prince decided that it was time for our heroine to warm up and announced that he would teach her to dance, after which he ordered her to stand opposite him. Raven immediately told her not to even think about going out on the dance floor until someone asked her to dance, and stated that his assistant would be her cover, explaining that she shouldn't worry about it. After these words, he added that excessive attention never leads to good, but just in case, it is better for her to be ready for everything. Our heroine could not believe that she would dance with the prince, but it happened. As befits, the young man invited the girl to dance and their hands joined. Then the prince showed her to put her other hand on his shoulder, but Angela was so worried that she froze like an icicle. Our heroine also stepped on the prince's foot and immediately began apologizing, arguing that it was dark here, and she herself thought that every time he came closer to her, she simply fell into a stupor. Raven explained how she should hold her head and said that during the dance it is impossible to look down, because the gaze must be directed to the eyes of the partner, and then noted that you also need to follow the rhythm of the melody. It seemed to the prince that he had explained everything succinctly, but when they began to dance, the young man had the idea that some kind of game was being played with him, where he had to evade the onslaught of her feet. He began to mentally ask the girl why she was doing this, and he was even embarrassed by this situation. And then he remembered that he had not danced for a long time and was trying to introduce the dance with one hand. At some point, our heroine noticed that the prince was also watching her legs and laughed. Raven asked in surprise why she was so funny, and the girl admitted that she just thought she wouldn't have to worry about the romance. Angela told the prince that she started writing because since childhood she had a habit of writing down all her pleasant dreams because she didn't want to forget them, so she started writing about him. Our heroine admitted that ever since she came here, she felt like she was living in a dream, and the prince asked her what she meant. Then the girl thought that, of course, with the exception of a few cases that stuck in her head, and while she was thinking, she stepped on the prince's feet again. Raven then used both hands and stated that there should be no mistakes in this approach to dancing. The prince remarked that if she stepped on his feet one more time, he would understand that she was doing it on purpose and would finish the lesson, after which he asked her to concentrate. Our heroine immediately noticed how his movements had changed and realized that now she would not be able to step on his foot, even if she tried to do it on purpose. The prince reminded her that he had forbidden her to look at their feet. When the young man held Angela's hand, she thought it was some kind of sign, and his silence made her worry and think that she was doing something wrong. They danced until the prince declared that our heroine perfectly followed his movements without making mistakes. Soon, a carriage was heading to Rudek Castle, in which was another bright character of this story, and her assistant drew the girl's attention to the sky in the empire, which was always high, trying to somehow comfort her mistress. But still the maid continued to lament at her lady, again crying, because the girl was so scared that she was afraid to even look up. She had heard of Crown Prince Rudek and knew that the man was surrounded by dark rumors as dark as the color of his hair. At last the princess was informed that their carriage had arrived at its destination when she had so dreaded the day. As a princess from a small kingdom, she was supposed to marry the Crown Prince Rudek to form an alliance between the countries, but she was afraid of the darkness that surrounded the groom. A little earlier, she met the bright and sweet prince and decided that it was useless to worry, and that day it seemed to her that the sky of the empire became a little lower. Princess Garnet was now being told that she had been called to a tea party and had to go to an unwanted meeting. The girl thought to herself that all the time she asked to be called the crown princess and noticed how the courtiers discussed her. On the other hand, she understood that sooner or later this empire would become hers and she would then set her own rules here. Our heroine was heading to the palace in the same way, and she liked the idea that she would soon see this building up close, peeking out from the carriage. The prince did not understand why she suddenly had such curiosity, and Manhwa was simply sprinkled with water through the constantly open curtain, and our heroine was always happy that the day of the feast had finally arrived. On the way, Raven seemed to have dozed off and the girl decided that he was very worried and therefore disconnected, about which she asked his assistant. Manhwa said that the prince had not been in the castle for a long time, and then noted that he had not appeared at banquets in a particularly long time. Our heroine began to think that it dates back to the time when our prince was kicked out of the castle, and when he was deprived of the title of crown prince. But as it turned out, Raven was completely awake and heard everything, after which he demanded from his assistant to sweep out of the carriage and make an effort to appear on time for the banquet. And our heroine thought that it was he who was driving her out, and the prince, meanwhile, added that nothing good will come of going to the castle only to stare in all directions and wander around idly. Angela even offered Manhwa her company as he got out of the carriage, but the young man replied that she still needed to get ready, so it was best to arrive early. Manhwa looked at the prince and asked if it was okay for him to be left alone, and Raven replied that he wanted peace and quiet, then asked the assistant to wander around the district and check on the situation. Our heroine, together with the prince's assistant, eventually stayed outside the carriage and decided that she had even managed to get used to everything in this chaos. While people were discussing whether Prince Raven would really come, and to be honest, this question was of great interest to many, and Manhwa immediately concluded that the atmosphere in the city was, as usual, very tense. Our heroine asked the young man to show her the city and stop worrying so much and conspiratorially asked if it was true that she and the prince spent their childhood here. Manhwa answered in the affirmative and promised to show the girl the neighborhood, and she already imagined the prince playing and running around here, and thought with admiration how cute it was. Suddenly, the people noticed one luxurious carriage and decided that it belonged to the prince, but another interesting person was rolling on it. Well, almost interesting, but still it was slowly rolling towards the castle to the west. The woman who was in it said that at this rate she would be late for tea, and now Manhwa understood why the prince had told our heroine to come later to avoid unnecessary acquaintances. And in the castle that most famous tea party had already begun, where everyone was exchanging judgments and quarrels. And Princess Garnet was in the midst of this society and thought that all these people would not calm down and seemed to be at war with each other. The women then noticed the crown princess and pointed out that she was beautiful as always, and emphasized that she must be lonely since she came from another country, and then expressed their envy at how well the crown prince was taking care of her. Garnet, as if disfigured, told her not to be called the crown princess because it would embarrass her since they were only engaged. The women began to admire her modesty and also wondered if they would announce their wedding at the upcoming banquet, noting that the mere thought of it already made their hearts tremble. Then those present talked about the beauty of the crown prince, and then began to talk about the fact that it is most likely that the first prince, that is, our Raven, should also attend today's banquet. When Garnet heard our prince's name, she remembered how dark and gloomy he was and even dropped her cup, breaking it. The girl began to reassure herself that the Rudek sky was still low and after so many years there was no reason to be afraid. And then she offered her deepest apologies and admitted that she was just a little nervous because she had not been to a banquet in a long time. At this moment the same lady from the slow-moving carriage joined the tea party and declared as they approached that they would not believe who she had just seen. The woman immediately said that it was none other than the first Prince Rudek, and everyone immediately became interested in the details of this event. This Anne immediately began to describe his beauty and height, confirming the words from the novel, and also expressing a wish that it would be good if he were her pup. Princess Garnet decided to go first and justified her decision by saying that she still needed to prepare everything, and asked everyone to enjoy the continuation of the conversation. The women immediately asked the newly arrived lady for all the details, and the princess defiantly left. Garnet couldn't believe that all these women had just been clinging to her and gossiping with each other, but as soon as they started talking about the first prince, all attention immediately turned to him and began to search for answers to the question of what is so wonderful about a man who was expelled from the castle and deprived of the title of Crown Prince. Meanwhile, Raven asked the guard if his sister had arrived, and when he learned that she was not yet in the castle, he asked the knight to inform her that he was in his room. At this time, the maid addressed Garnet as a princess, and the girl again nervously stated that she had asked to be called only the Crown Princess and was so indignant that she did not see and simply tripped next to our prince. Raven recognized Garnet and she recognized him, the same gloomy and dark one that sat in her memory all this time and tormented her with fears. The all-knowing lady suggested that it must have been strange for the princess to remember this, since after all her fiancé was originally the first prince. The same women then saw Princess Garnet meet our prince and watched their reactions, and Raven was now thinking that she was Frederick's future wife. The maid whispered to the princess that it was Duke Raven, and the girl finally understood that she should congratulate him, but he preceded her and bowed himself. Garnet looked at the person she feared so much, who was now showing her respect. The surrounding audience, including the interested young ladies, found this scene extremely strange. The Chancellor also noticed these two and thought that our prince had come all alone and without servants and even without an author. Then remembered that the mercenary he had sent to kill our heroine had not returned either, and decided that he would make the return of our prince as possible more miserable. Raven, meanwhile, told Princess Garnet that he and his sister would welcome her properly to the banquet hall. Then the princess reached her hand to our prince's face and asked him why he had such a troubled expression on his face, supposing that he was unwell. And then she completely offered to take him to his room, to which the prince asked her to refrain from actions that could cause misunderstanding among people, reminding her that they were being watched. The prince said goodbye to her and left, and the princess was left to draw conclusions. At the same time, Raven noticed that the Chancellor was also watching what was happening, and eventually stated that he needed to see the Crown Prince. Garnet concluded that his cold demeanor was due to some kind of joke and assumed that the rumors about his character were true. The princess also decided for herself that even if he was cold with her, his hands were gentle and she liked it. And now you can see how the Crown Prince's assistant stood in front of the woman's mannequin, and the maid complimented him that the knight looks good with both short and long hair. The maid asked the young man if he was going to wear a dress, and assumed that he wanted to look good for someone in particular, but Bourbon was still thinking. He wanted to make his master smile and was looking for a way to do it. At this time he saw the Chancellor making his way to the Crown Prince's room, and thinking what threats he was going to use this time, he decided to guard his master's door himself. Bourbon heard how the Chancellor told his nephew not to invent anything more and not to drag it out, and during the banquet to confess in front of everyone, so that no one would do anything stupid. Princess Garnet got ready and was on her way to the banquet when she saw the Crown Prince and immediately spoke to him, trying to find out where he was in such a hurry and if there was anything she could do to help him. And noticing that he had gone away, she was surprised that Frederick didn't even dare to look at her. The princess walked and thought that even the infamous first prince bowed to her, and this one dares to simply ignore her when he became the Crown Prince only after fighting for the throne. Garnet wondered if the first prince was indeed above Frederick in status, and thought he should be nicer to her. The princess even thought about the fact that she should marry our prince, who turned out to be better than this second one. She thought so much about herself that she slipped and fell right into the arms of our prince's sister, but the princess didn't know about it yet, because she only saw her eyes. Garnet, thinking it was Raven, saw in his eyes that he smiled at her, and assumed that he acted like that because he was being watched by a whole crowd. Hoya, meanwhile, entered her brother's room and stated that she came fully clothed to see how things were going. And she reported that everyone mistook her for Raven, and then she admitted that on the way to the apartment, she recruited a few more fans for our prince. The brother, being in the gloomiest mood, asked his sister where it was worn, and she in response asked where his assistant and author was, and why he was alone. Raven said he had them come right at the beginning of the banquet so they would have a chance to avoid meeting the other aristocrats. Hoya was very surprised that her brother appeared at the palace alone and wondered how he managed to do this, and whether human looks were not so terrible. But Raven's mood was very bad, and Hoya understood that the problem here is not with the author, so with the words that he is still such a coward, she rushed to hug our prince. The Crown Prince expressed the hope that he would be left alone, at least when he was just going out for air, but his aide apologized and added that it was his direct duty to protect him. Bourbon was devoted to his master to the limit, only because of the words when he inquired if everything was all right with him. The assistant said that if he was gone for too long, everyone would go looking for him. Meanwhile, our heroine and Manhwa finally reached the palace, and when they were walking through the courtyard, Frederick saw them and immediately remembered that he had completely forgotten about this girl and even wondered if our heroine had put on shoes for today's event. Manhwa was waiting for our heroine, but she did not come, and even the guard said that it was time to close the door because the feast was already starting. But Angela was just a little lost, or rather looked at the fireworks outside the window, and at that time it was announced that the first Prince Rudek and his sister had arrived at the ball. Hoya assumed that they showed up early, and then concluded that somehow they were able to attend the banquet this time only thanks to our teachings. Raven soon noticed Mono, but he was without Angela, and the prince began to worry where our heroine was. Next, the arrival of Crown Prince Rudek and Princess Garnet was announced, and they entered together. The princess immediately noticed that our prince was very indifferent to people and concluded that it was very cute, and Hoya immediately remembered the girl from the stairs and thought that she was seriously wrong. The Crown Prince announced that it was time to declare the beginning of the banquet, and the audience began to admire this couple, who immediately became the center of the hall. Frederick then said that before they start, he would like to thank everyone present, but especially the Espelon family, our twins, for leading the nation to victory. Hoya tried to calm her brother down and told him that things are different now. And at that moment, our heroine flew into the hall and demonstratively apologized for being late. Hoya immediately wondered why their author had entered through the official entrance. Meanwhile, people began to whisper to each other who it was that so brazenly interrupted the prince's speech, and emphasized that she had no honor or dignity, and even suggested that she had sneaked in and there were paparazzi. When Angela came down, the young people began to whisper about the fact that she is clearly from aristocratic women and should be invited to the dance. Hoya even doubted that it was the same girl, and our prince said that she was quite interesting, and these words alarmed his sister. Princess Garnet drew Frederick's attention to her and emphasized that everyone was waiting for the announcement, and thought to herself what this crown prince was doing or not doing. But at that moment, the music started to play and people started dancing, and then Mono complimented our heroine that she was great and kept her composure well. Angela was already thinking about what it would be like to dance with the prince in such a place. Meanwhile, two young aristocrats were already looking for an opportunity to invite our heroine to a dance, but the prince's assistant carefully guarded her and did not sign anyone. At one point, our heroine asked Mono what she looked like, and then said that they were standing here completely alone. The young man declared that it was his fault, then explained that his master had told him to not let her talk to other aristocrats at all if possible. And then the girl asked if she had just studied like that and they underestimated her so much. Angela was constantly looking for the prince with her eyes and found that he was very far from her, and besides, she was constantly surrounded by these gorgeous people and began to realize how big the gulf was between them. Our heroine understood that she was just a fan and thought that in his place, she also would not want to spoil such an event for the sake of some fan. The sister dragged her brother into a conversation, although before that our heroine saw that she met the prince's eyes. Hoya immediately noticed that people paid little attention to the scientist, and assumed that if she continued to be quieter than water and shorter than grass, then there would be no problems. As for herself, the princess thought that the situation on the stairs was too confusing, so she decided to tell her brother about it later. Although Princess Garnet was constantly looking in the direction of our prince, and it can be said that she did not take her eyes off him, Frederick thought about his, or rather about our heroine, where he first wanted to observe her actions to understand what kind of person she is, but there was no one near her, so it was not possible to learn anything. Kronprince came to the conclusion that all this is connected with the fact that Raven's bodyguard is hanging around this girl all the time and it annoyed him. Hoya, meanwhile, asked her brother if he really got attached to the scientist and added that she was sure that she told him not to do it. Raven pondered her words, all the moments they spent with this girl flashed through his mind, and replied that he didn't know, and Hoya asked him to finally get out of the habit of not giving a clear answer. And in the meantime, very interesting events unfolded, because the crown prince got up from the throne and headed somewhere, and his princess followed him, and all this was carefully watched by curious eyes, and not only. Frederick, meanwhile, invited our heroine to a joint dance. The crown prince said that it would be rude of him to leave such a beauty standing alone in the corner of the banquet hall. Everyone immediately began to whisper that the heir had invited someone to the dance for the first time, and began to be interested in his partner, while the princess did not understand what was happening right in front of her eyes. Hoya was also surprised, and mentally resented that he really didn't know who this girl was, and assumed that she probably didn't even know how to dance and would now find herself in an awkward position, and our prince decided to come to the rescue of our heroine. Hoya stopped her brother and began to ask what he was doing and stated that it would be strange if he went there too, and Princess Garnet noticed that even Raven was paying attention to that girl. Mono approached Bourbon and asked him to forgive his master. The bodyguard of the crown prince replied that they don't know that simple knights like them cannot interfere in the affairs of lords. Meanwhile, our heroine thought that it would be strange to refuse the invitation of the crown prince. At the same time, she looked at our prince and thought that she was just a fan who should not spoil the event. Raven turned to his sister and began to talk about the question she recently asked him, while he himself looked in the direction of our heroine. The crown prince, dancing with our heroine, immediately declared that he was very happy to see her at this event. Then he asked how she was living in the duke's residence and whether the prince was kind to her, and heard the answer that the prince was an incredible person and she was fine with him. Angela looked in Raven's direction and wondered why his silhouette from the back looked so sad, and decided that he was most likely just pretending he had nothing to do with it again. Our heroine thought so much that she accidentally stepped on the crown prince's foot and started apologizing. And then she remembered the instructions of her prince, who said that you should raise your head and look only at your partner. She also followed the guidelines for a sense of rhythm and decided that she had nothing to be sad about. The girl came to the idea that she should stop flying with dreams in the clouds and return to reality in order to become more polite with her partner, as she was taught. When our heroine smiled, the Crown Prince was glad that it finally happened, and found the girl extremely unpredictable. Raven could not be indifferent to this situation and kept looking back at our heroine, and then he thought about what he was doing and decided to go. He reasoned that he was screwing himself up for no reason, which he didn't need to do, but at that moment an unfamiliar young lady asked for his attention. The girl asked him to dance with her, but he just showed his scary expression and left. Those present began to whisper about the fact that it seems that the novel is actually just fiction. The Crown Prince, meanwhile, inquired of our heroine whether she danced well with him, and the girl answered that he was very easy to follow, and afterwards thought that her answer sounded rather graceful. Angela even thought that the Crown Prince must be surprised why she danced so well, after which she looked in the direction of the prince and did not find him in the former place. The girl immediately swayed and pretended to have some problem with her shoes, and Frederick noticed that she was back in her shoes. Our heroine was madly embarrassed by what had happened and began to apologize for causing him a lot of trouble. The Crown Prince generally stated that he probably should not have insisted on the dance. Angela eventually apologized for losing her balance, and Frederick replied that it was probably better to end this dance, at which point the girl replied that she couldn't claim the honor of dancing with him alone and thanked her for the dance. Manhwa immediately began to wonder what happened to her, and the girl constantly looked where our prince had disappeared. Angela replied that she was nervous and needed to get out and get some air, and asked him not to worry about her. The aristocrats immediately surrounded the prince and began to introduce themselves and introduce him to their daughters. But Frederick had already lost all interest in this event and was completely indifferent to those around him. The Chancellor watched all of this and concluded that his nephew was definitely stupid and like a puppy that was getting more and more out of control, then became disappointed in his mercenary who didn't complete the order and decided that he would try again. The paparazzi were also at this event and were well disguised, although they found their disadvantages in it. Blaine saw that everything was much more complicated and did not even think that he would be able to draw so many interesting things. And our heroine went into the air and thought about what was happening to her today and why the Crown Prince invited her to the dance, assuming that he was trying to extract some information from her, but it would not be surprising, because she recently joined the ranks of his political opponent. On the other hand, the girl remembered that he showed his kindness to her at the moment when her shoes were exposed, and covered them with his cloak so that no one could see her old shoes. Our heroine remembered his face, which clearly did not depict anger, and decided that she had dealt with him extremely harshly. Angela regretted that her shoes had slipped off so badly, and even imagined how our prince would look at that moment if he noticed this incident. The girl caught herself thinking that she was thinking about the prince again, although on the other hand it was not surprising, because she was his fan. Our heroine noticed the prince, who was standing a little far from her, and wondered what he was doing there. Then the girl thought about the fact that she wondered what he was thinking about at that moment and assumed that he was also admiring the fireworks. Only Angela was about to call him when someone else's voice called out to him. It was the same Princess Garnet who had come to him with the words that he was standing here alone on such a momentous day, and suggested that he was oppressed by some heavy thoughts. Our heroine was even scared, but continued to watch this scene. The girl slowly approached the prince, and then just threw herself into his arms. Our heroine thought about whether it was appropriate for them to behave like this, and at that moment the all-knowing lady noticed Angela and became interested in her person, especially after the Crown Prince danced with her. The woman declared that it was a very unexpected meeting, moreover, a pleasant one, and admitted that she couldn't wait to chat with our heroine, and then immediately asked what she does for a living. She also came to the conclusion that something interesting had happened and she was told about it by an alert gossip. Our heroine immediately gave a negative answer and stated that she was simply lost and started asking for directions to the banquet hall, trying to divert her attention from the prince. Raven, meanwhile, made out with Garnet and said that he had already warned about the distance between them once earlier today. The prince also said that he did not understand why she was doing this, and added that the Crown Prince would worry if she was gone too long, and the princess replied that he really did not care about her. Garnet asked Raven if it wouldn't be much better to have him by her side and added that she meant the role of Crown Prince. When the princess continued to convince our prince that she could be very useful to him, our heroine tried to distract the inquisitive lady from the conversation between Raven and Garnet. The princess noticed that they were being seen and deliberately and sharply pushed the prince so that this particular picture could be seen by the inquisitive lady. Garnet hurriedly hid behind the wall and thought about how scared she was and decided that she should be more careful from now on. When our prince was already alone, that lady noticed him and recognized him, after which she decided to gossip with our heroine. Raven wondered why this blonde kept getting confused under his feet and walked away. Then the woman said that now nothing prevents them from enjoying this spectacle alone, and our heroine was thinking about whether she did the right thing by scaring these two. Already undercover, Princess Garnet apologized to Raven for pushing him away so sharply and explained that she was just scared. The prince accepted her request and said that they would think that he did not hear what she told him. Garnet then exclaimed that he had feelings for her too and asked why he was behaving like that, to which the prince replied that he had never felt affection for her. The girl remained in complete disappointment and did not understand why he was touching her like that, remembering their meeting on the stairs. The princess walked with thoughts of whether he would act as if it had never happened, and thought with complaint that he had started first. Garnet then remembered his twin sister and how she was tall and looked a lot like her brother, and assumed that if she dressed like a man, no one would notice the difference between them. The princess came to the conclusion that she had just come across her then, and thought that the girl had only played a joke on her and was now angry with her for playing such a childish trick on her. Manhwa began to worry that our heroine was very late and noticed this know-it-all lady started gossiping that she had just seen the girl who danced with the crown prince and started spreading the word that she, a new scientist from the house of the first prince. The woman immediately stated that she had spoken to our heroine and concluded that she was a calm and decent girl, and the prince's assistant decided that Angela was better, after which the ladies began to discuss the gloom of our prince. And Hoya decided to talk to Manhwa and called him for a conversation, asking if he was going to look for a scientist. The young man informed her that he intended to find our heroine and clarified what exactly she wanted to ask. Then Hoya told him that while he was looking for the author, he had to complete her task at the same time. And somewhere in the palace, our heroine was sitting and thinking about the fact that she was infinitely exhausted and could not even find the reason for her fatigue. And she herself returned her thoughts to that scene on the balcony and thought that even if she asked the prince about that incident directly, he would not tell her the truth. Meanwhile, Blaine was wandering in the depths of the palace to get rid of all the glasses that were hanging on him and pondering why people gave him glasses, and came across our heroine. Angela immediately asked him how he dared to come in here without the prince's knowledge, and the boy did not understand how he had been declassified when he had a perfect disguise. When our heroine said that she would report him to the prince, the paparazzi decided to trade pictures with her and promised to give her one portrait of the prince. He saw that one paper would not do, and declared that he was ready to give even several, only that she would not give him away, because this was his only way of earning a living. And the girl concluded that his drawings were as always of the highest order, and the guy was glad that it was like his devoted fan to switch so quickly to his side. Then our heroine declared that she was glad to see him here and was surprised that he had painted so much during this time. Angela started to question Blaine about why he was doing well with the prince and she looked so obscure, to which Blaine replied that why bother drawing other people, especially if she's just a minor character huddled next to the crown prince. The girl looked at the drawings and thought, and the boy noticed this and began to take away his sketches, not understanding what was happening to her face when she looked at these images and thought that our heroine did not like them. Blaine also noticed that the girl had an extremely depressed look and asked her if she didn't hit Prince Raven just because she danced with Frederick once, and our heroine replied that he misunderstood everything. Blaine picked one of the pictures and handed it to our heroine, saying that it was the only picture he could give her, and pointed out that this is what she looked like when the crown prince asked her to the dance. Angela began to demand that he immediately give her the most normal drawing and not upset her, and the guy in response asked if she had not stopped being fanatical about the prince. Then the girl explained that he simply looked like a completely different person. And meanwhile the prince exposed his assistant and declared that he did not remember that he gave the order to kill the author, and asked whether he received this task from his sister. The prince noticed that Manhwa had pointed his sword at him and stated this directly to his face. And then he asked his assistant whose knight he was in general and whose orders he was following. Angela ran away again and thought that she had reasons for this again, related to the prince, and wondered why she had been avoiding him all the time since arriving at the palace. Our heroine noticed the fallen paparazzi drawing and saw that it was quite neatly connected vertically. The girl began to think that she really wanted to have a different picture, because just looking at this scene reminded the girl of what our prince looked like then. But suddenly she noticed that this picture even depicted Raven, albeit from the back. Although then it occurred to her that even in this picture she had to watch him indifferently look away, and thought that she was a real fool. Our heroine mentally wondered how she could even call herself a true fan. Raven, meanwhile, stood thinking about how things had been going wrong since he arrived, and decided that he didn't like going to the palace after all, and his assistant, when asked who he served, stated, "That does not know." Manhwa begged for mercy and admitted that Princess Hoya had left the decision up to him, and he was the one who raised his sword, and the prince decided that he must have impressed him a lot with his appearance, because he clearly can't even think. The aide stated that since our heroine works for them, he concluded that it would be dangerous if her faith in him wavered even a little. Manhwa also said that ever since they had died in the palace, the girl had seemed very disturbed for some reason, and the prince had asked her to speak more quietly. The aide stated that everything concerning his master needed to be dealt with before things got out of hand, so he decided to take this step. The prince replied that our heroine behaved in this way because he could not trust her, so the fault lies with him, and asked him to be silent, but Angela happened to hear that they were talking about something. Young people heard her cry, and then saw her and began to wonder how long ago she appeared here. In the meantime, the prince told his assistant to get up, gather and go report to the princess about the work done. Our heroine also came to her senses and said that she was very sorry that she had stepped aside for so long and made everyone worry. Angela asked the prince to be alone and discuss a matter that was bothering her, and Raven asked to follow him, removing the cricket from her head. While Manhwa was about to leave, our heroine was in unprecedented delight at the fact that the prince stroked her head and asked his assistant if he had seen it. When the young man left, he could not believe what he was going to do, daring to kill our heroine. Princess Garnet, meanwhile, was thinking that she couldn't enter the event like this, and decided to announce that she was going to rest in her room. And then she thought that the crown prince wouldn't be looking for her at all, because she left without saying not a word. The upset girl thought that he must be happy that he got rid of her so successfully, and thought that she was sick of Rudek people. The princess remembered our prince's words that Frederick would worry if she was gone too long, and decided that he didn't understand because he was a fool who didn't even know what his sister was up to. The girl then mentally turned back to Raven and also mentally asked him if he had taken care of her. And our heroine admitted to the prince that time she did not run away when he appeared, and then noted that this palace was well known to him and admitted that she even managed to get lost in it. How huge it is. Then the girl remembered that she had forgotten that he lived here as a child and thought that all this sounded from her lips as an attempt to tease him about the fact that he no longer lived here. Meanwhile, the prince approached our heroine and said that from the very beginning he wanted to confess something to her. Angela looked at him, and since he was silent, embarrassed, she asked what he wanted to say and closed her eyes. Raven told her to open her eyes and told her that they don't wear a cape like she does and explained that it should be draped over her shoulders. Our heroine wondered in her mind why she should be informed about it in such a manner and thought that she had only rejoiced in vain. Then Raven hid his face in the palm of his hand and asked our heroine if she knew how hard it was for him to hold back his laughter when he saw her. And the girl wondered if everything was really so funny and came to the conclusion that, noticing such a rare sight, like the prince's laughter, somehow she feels defeated. The prince, on the contrary, felt disgusted and did not understand the reason for this condition, and then he thought that maybe it was connected with his arrival at the palace. He remembered the day he was stripped of his crown prince title and given to Frederick. Hoya stated that day that they were leaving the palace, explaining that it would be easier for them if they quietly spent a few years at the estate. He knew that his sister had blamed him for what had happened and had spoken out about it, but then apologized for saying it out of spite. Raven then stated that he had nothing to pack and suggested that his sister go first and he would come later because he needed to look at one place. Hoya tried to find out what was there, but he didn't admit that his girlfriend was there and our little heroine was part-time. Our heroine, meanwhile, turned to the prince and said that she was embarrassed to talk about all this because it sounded petty out loud. And then she said that when the crown prince invited her to the dance, she thought that he, that is, our prince, it was completely indifferent or something like that. Due to Raven's silence, our heroine thought that there was something wrong with her clothing or something, and decided to ask him quietly that when she was in the spotlight, wasn't he worried that she would end up doing something errors. Then the prince admitted that it was unbearable for him to watch, and then corrected himself that he meant her strange dance and declared that he had been teaching her to do everything wrong, and then just muttered the last thing to himself. And our heroine came to the conclusion that silence is replaced by awkwardness, and concluded that this is like some kind of law. Angela then hesitantly said that she actually wanted to ask him something else. Our heroine began to remind the prince about that meeting with the princess on the balcony and asked him what the situation was there. The prince was silent, and the girl assumed that it would be like gossip and did not know what to say next. Raven thought back to the day he had been stripped of his title and remembered how people had whispered that they were blood-bearing twins and assumed that the bishop's words were true. When their mother asked the chancellor for intercessory help, he replied that the second empress was his younger sister, but now she has been killed, and he seethes with anger as he listens to Prince Raven's excuses. The chancellor also inquired of their mother whether she had not heard the terrible rumors which were now on everyone's lips. Our heroine noticed the thoughtfulness of the prince and thought that he, as usual, does not answer, and this can already be considered the norm. Then the girl decided to change the subject and told the prince that he was very handsome today and looked very classy with his hair up, but then added that he looked very cute with his regular hair too. Angela also decided to ask him if he purposely told her that she was wearing the wrong dress and then just blurted out that there were too many mice in the estate. But the prince's attention was impenetrable because his thoughts were somewhere very far away. Our heroine came to the conclusion that there was no point in talking to herself and decided to leave, saying that it was getting cold here and it was time to go back to the palace. The girl tried to interrupt his thoughts again, but saw that it was useless. The prince remembered how his sister had told him that they had all been abandoned, even the coachman, and that he would have to take an ordinary carriage to get where he wanted to go. Raven finally came back to reality and tried to stop our heroine, and he still heard his sister's words about why he thought she wouldn't leave him. The prince caught up with the girl and asked her to wait, after which he addressed her with the words that he could not now explain to her what had happened on the balcony. Our heroine smiled and replied that everything was fine, then added that she would wait for the moment when he felt he could share it with her. The girl said that it seemed to her that he had come to his senses precisely because of her recent words and that it pleased her, and the prince in response asked what she was talking about. Then our confused heroine admitted that she wanted to dance with him and called him her prince. Raven was completely confused by what Angela was saying, so he asked if that was all she was talking about while he was only thinking about the past and answered in agreement. Our prince said he wouldn't mind dancing together, especially since she's been working so hard this week. Raven offered to dance right here, since he didn't want to go back to the banquet hall, and our heroine agreed. It should be said that ever since Hoya saw how he suffered at the loss of the chick he had nursed as a child, she had always wanted to get rid of things before the prince could take them kindly, for she could not bear to see his tears, because then they both had one face. And now, when that time had really come, the princess herself began to doubt her decision. Therefore, she put the choice on Mono's shoulders and declared that if they both decided to trust the author, then she believed that the girl was worthy of it. Meanwhile, the ladies present were eagerly discussing our prince and how he very rudely rejected the requests of some young ladies when he came to the palace for the first time in many years, and then they began to wonder where the scholar had disappeared to. They also draw conclusions about Frederick, who they believe could have left first, but stays until the very end and is therefore definitely trustworthy. The servant, meanwhile, informed the crown prince that he needed to make an announcement regarding the princess and emphasized that the mention came from the chancellor and asked if they should find Garnet. But Frederick replied in the negative and explained that he had nothing to announce. Hoya, meanwhile, is determined to deal with the evil tongues that carry all kinds of nonsense even though she is around. Manhwa was already worried about whether everything was going to be okay and assumed there would be another wave of rumors after the banquet. And the princess told him that so far everything was going as Frederick wanted, then reminded him that they had an author and they should look at the situation more broadly. While our heroes danced, the paparazzi stealthily depicted this scene on a piece of paper, joking with Angela, calling her another thing and emphasizing that the scene he really wanted to make an effort to draw had finally arrived. Meanwhile, the inquisitive ladies also watched the events between the Duke and the scientist, who were dancing, and found their couple wonderful. The women decided that the first prince did have a romantic side that was described in that book. The chancellor also witnessed what was going on, and one thing he concluded was that the whole thing annoyed the hell out of him. 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 Whole thing annoyed